The case of Judy Southern. Sometimes, from the very beginning of an investigation, everything seems to work out. The Supreme Court might directly point to a criminal, but practice shows that they are not always correct. While they tried to connect one person to the crime, the real culprit was walking free. Judy lived in Manhattan, New York, USA. She was a young woman who worked part-time at the post office. She always focused more on family and children than on career success. However, she wanted to get an education. Therefore, after graduating from high school, she entered college and successfully graduated. During this period, she met Alan Southern. They began a relationship and then got married. Judy and Alan lived together for more than 6 years. They raised a child together. From the outside, it seemed that everything was fine in their family, until one day that destroyed the entire family idyll. On June 7, 2000, Judy was in a good mood as she went to work in the morning, delivering mail around the area. At about 3:30 p.m., she returned home and, as always, found no one there yet. Judy arrived first and was getting ready for her husband to return from work. She had a 5-year-old son who was visiting his grandparents at that time. The boy was supposed to return in the evening. Once inside, Judy immediately noticed a strange mess on the kitchen table and found a suspicious note. She remembered that no one was there when she left for work. No one from the household could have come and left a message. Her husband was at work and never showed up during the day. Judy didn't have time to figure it all out, began to read the note, which turned out to have quite disturbing content. While she scanned the piece of paper, a stranger came out of a dark room and headed towards her, weapon at the ready. Without warning, he attacked her twice. The first bullet missed, but the second hit Judy in the lower abdomen. She fell to the floor and screamed in pain, losing consciousness. When she came to her senses, the attacker was nowhere to be seen. Judy barely reached the phone and tried to call her husband for help. But the phone was not working. She wanted to get to her mobile phone but could not remember where she left it. Fearing that the stranger might still be nearby, Judy crawled to the front door and carefully opened it. She stood up, leaning against the wall, left the house. Judy tried to attract the attention of others to scare off the criminal. She was bleeding and managed to walk only a couple of meters before she fell down exhausted. She knew her husband would be finishing work soon and would be near the house. That is exactly what happened. A few minutes later, he drove up in his car and immediately noticed his wife lying on the ground near the house. Judy was covered in blood but still alive. Alan picked her up and placed her in the back seat of the car. Judy was weak but tried to tell him about the attack. She pointed to the courtyard, but her husband still didn't understand what she wanted. There was no time to figure it out. Alan realized his wife's condition could be critical. Driving towards the hospital, Alan dialed 911, informed them that he had found his wife wounded near their house and was heading to the hospital. He asked them to meet them on the way. Judy was still conscious, said that a man had attacked her. She mentioned the name like Barry several times, claiming he had set up an ambush. By the time Judy arrived at the hospital, she had already lost consciousness. Doctors urgently took her to the operating room, but she died right on the table before receiving help. Her twin sister, Trudy Smith, arrived at the medical center a few minutes later. Alan informed her about the attack. She hurried because she wanted to support her sister. However, she doesn't have enough time. When Trudy received the tragic news of her sister's death, she approached Alan and accused him of what had happened. Alan seemed embarrassed. Trudy vowed to bring him to justice. The police immediately spoke to Alan, who became the main suspect. Because, typically, the closest people are involved in such cases. From the very beginning, Alan referenced Judy's own words about the shooting and the ambush organized by a certain Barry. The problem was that he did not know a single person among her acquaintances by that name. Trudy also could not recall anyone by that name. Meanwhile, forensic experts examined the crime scene and managed to find a considerable amount of evidence confirming that someone had indeed set up an ambush there and spent a significant amount of time in the house waiting for the victim. Such persistence seemed to indicate hatred, anger, and a personal motive. This only confirmed to the detectives that the criminal should be sought among the victim's immediate surroundings. Nothing was stolen from the house, so the robbery theory was immediately excluded. Mysterious Barry had taken a shower, played video games, and even found an adult toy belonging to Judy. It is not known what he did with it or why he left it in a prominent place in the bedroom. It became why Judy could not call from home for help. It was impossible because the killer had cut the phone line. He clearly wanted to deprive the victim of any chance to survive, and it worked. Doctors were sure that with timely assistance, she could have been saved. Despite the fact that the shot did not kill her immediately and she was able to leave the house, there was no one to help her. Unfortunately, she had to wait for Alan to arrive for some time, during which she lost a lot of blood. The detectives discovered traces of Alan, her husband. He continued to insist that he had nothing to do with the ambush. There were cigarette butts lying everywhere in the house, suggesting that the killer had smoked more than a pack of cigarettes while waiting for Judy. During the investigation, it turned out that neither the victim herself nor her husband smoked that brand of cigarettes, although this was not strong evidence of his innocence. This became the first piece of evidence in favor of Alan's alibi. It was strange that the criminal had entered the house without breaking in. Alan believed that all the windows and doors should have been closed before he left for work, but the shooter could have escaped through the window, which was wide open. During the searches, Alan remembered that his wife sometimes left the kitchen window slightly open to air out the house. This change in testimony was perceived as a very alarming sign. Spent cartridges were found at the scene of the crime. The first bullet hit a wooden wall. Flax was collected for further examination, and the police tried their best to find the weapon, but it was all in vain. Now, locating it had become a priority. It was believed that Alan managed to dispose of the gun, and naturally, he did not confess to this. Everything seemed to be against Alan. He was the first to report the incident and had spent the last minutes of Judy's life with her. His entire car was covered in blood, as were his hands and clothes. When Alan's office was searched, even more suspicious evidence was found. A special device for recording calls was installed on the family's home phone. Thanks to it, Alan could listen to their conversations while at work, checking his suspicions. This immediately drew the attention of the authorities to Alan. This became a reason to increase pressure on him. The most curious piece of evidence was a note found at the scene, which appeared to be a suicide note, but not written by Judy or her husband. A new name also surfaced in this case, Jonathan. On the other hand, Alan and Judy had serious problems, which offered more reasons to commit a crime. The recordings of telephone conversations were linked to his attempts to catch his wife in infidelity. He planned to use all of this to gain an advantage in court during their pending divorce. As it turned out, both were unfaithful in their marriage. Alan had already had 2 mistresses, which Judy knew about. These affairs significantly contributed to the collapse of their marriage. At the time of the attack, Judy also had a lover. They contacted him, but the man's name was not Jonathan, and he did not appear to look like a killer from the beginning. All suspicions were removed when he provided a reliable alibi. Just 2 days before her death, Judy had called and complained about problems in the marriage, mentioning that they were even sleeping in different rooms, that for over a month, nothing had kept them together except for their 5-year-old son, Jacob. Judy had long wanted to file for divorce, but saw how well her child was with his father and did not want to ruin that bond. Alan truly played a significant role in Jacob's life. However, this no longer mattered against the backdrop of constant quarrels. Judy could no longer tolerate the conflicts and was planning to file for divorce. It is obvious that this gave Alan more reasons for anger. He could have been jealous of her, fearing that he would lose his son or be forced to share custody or pay alimony. Trudy confirmed that they indeed had disputes about their child, and both wanted to obtain custody rights, making the divorce process expectedly difficult. Trudy, too, had reason to confront Alan with accusations right in the medical center. However, the most compelling and disturbing arguments for the investigation came from Judy's friends. Everyone knew that Judy had serious marital problems, but the situation was worse than it seemed. Judy had repeatedly stated that if something happened to her, Alan would definitely be guilty. The possibility of financial motives for the crime also emerged. As their relationship began to crumble, Alan could solve all his problems at once and gain some benefit. This turned out to be true because a life insurance policy for Judy was found during the investigation, with her husband and son as the beneficiaries. Of course, Alan denied everything. He was interrogated for hours, but he insisted that under no circumstances would he kill the mother of his child. He claimed that he loved his son too much to deprive him of the most valuable person in his son's life. According to the investigation, there was not enough evidence to bring charges. More material evidence was needed. At a minimum, it was necessary to wait for the results of all the examinations. Contrary to the detectives' expectations, doubts about the correctness of the choice of the main suspect arose with the first reports. The note found in the courtyard of the Southern house, identified as a suicide note, was signed by a certain Jonathan. However, the handwriting was not very legible, and the note itself was slightly contaminated with the blood of Judy. Complicating matters, it was clear that the note was addressed to a woman named Melanie and the letter was addressed to my wife, Melanie. At first, this confusion deepened because Melanie Southern did not exist, but there were other details in the letter, including an address that matched with Melanie Binney. This young woman lived at the location indicated in the note. She had a daughter and a husband named Jonathan Binney. The Binney family home was located approximately 5 kilometers from the ambush site where Judy was found. When the police checked Jonathan Binney in their database, it turned out that he fit the profile of the killer, as he had previously encountered problems with the law. Until recently, Jonathan had committed only minor offenses, but he was now under investigation for something far more serious. Shortly before Judy's death, he had abused his 3-month-old daughter. Initially, detectives believed that this note could have been written by Alan to mislead them and remove suspicion from himself. However, this clue needed proper analysis. In the suicide letter, Jonathan indicated that he wanted to leave this life voluntarily because he could not imagine being imprisoned for abusing a child. This all appeared suspicious when the detectives arrived at his house, where they found only his wife, Melanie. She admitted that he had not lived there since her statement about the child abuse case. Melanie was very angry with Jonathan. When she found out what happened to the Southern family, she was shocked because, in her opinion, Jonathan did not look like a killer, although she was no longer sure of anything. She was amazed at how close she had let a true madman, capable of such atrocities, into her life. She told the police where Jonathan could be, and the detectives arrived at the specified address, but even there, the suspect could not be found. Investigators contacted his close friends, but they also did not know where he could be. In the media, an alert was issued that a dangerous criminal was on the run, and they believed he could not have gone far. Additionally, considering the suicide note, they expected to find his lifeless body sooner. Tracking him down, the police used K-9 units with specially trained dogs and aerial support from police helicopters. The search took nearly a day until finally the dogs led the police to the basement of a house. There, Jonathan was found lying on the floor, shirtless, with 6 nicotine patches stuck to his chest. He was alive. The man told the police that he had attempted to take his own life by overdosing on nicotine. This was probably meant to convince everyone that he felt remorseful. Jonathan did not resist when he was arrested. He even seemed a little glad that it was all finally over. At the time of the crime, Jonathan Binney was 26 years old. His behavior raised doubts about his mental stability. Some suspected he might have mental issues. However, a psychiatric examination indicated that he was aware of his actions both during and after the crime. This led investigators to suspect that he was merely trying to elicit sympathy with his threats. Melanie provided detectives with writing samples that were analyzed by a handwriting expert. The expert found several significant characteristics that distinguished Jonathan's handwriting. He noted the similarity in the spelling of the lowercase g and f in the suicide note and in the samples. According to the analysis, there was almost a 100% probability that this letter was written by Jonathan himself. After this conclusion, the case against Alan began to collapse. Prior to Jonathan's arrest, the police had offered Alan a polygraph test. He agreed and passed with flying colors, which should have strengthened their confidence in his innocence, but they did not want to let him go. Alan was kept under suspicion until Jonathan confessed to attacking Judy, making it clear that Alan had no involvement in the crime. Alan was subsequently released. Another key piece of evidence was the DNA found on the toy in the house. The expert used dozens of filters to collect particles of saliva and skin from the killer, which also matched Jonathan's profile. This linked him to the crime scene. The day before Jonathan was arrested, the police found a 9mm handgun, a significant discovery. Despite a thorough search, they did not find this 9mm handgun registered to Alan. The gun was later confiscated and examined, but ballistics tests showed that it was not the weapon used to kill Judy. However, a dog team found another gun of the appropriate caliber in the woods near the house. Ballistics experts were now able to compare the bullets, cartridges, and guns. Tests were conducted. The markings on the bullets were then compared to objects from the scene of the massacre. The tests allowed investigators to prove that Judy was shot with this pistol. Fingerprints were found on the handle of the pistol, which also led to the arrest of a child abuser, Jonathan. During the search of Jonathan's house, police managed to find 9mm Cobra cartridges for a concealed carry pistol on the body under his clothing, as well as other evidence. All this confirmed that Jonathan was the weapon's owner. Melanie also told the police that he always carried a weapon with him, which he bought for self-defense. However, this had little effect on the situation with Alan. Even after that, he still looked suspicious. There were too many doubts against him because of the existing motive. Therefore, his status changed. It was now believed that he did not kill his wife with his own hands but became the mastermind behind the murder, using Jonathan as the executor. However, he refused to admit he didn't even know Jonathan. The theory that Alan hired Jonathan to kill his wife was also carefully investigated for a long time. The correspondence and calls were analyzed, but no connection leading Judy to Jonathan could be found. It seemed they were not acquainted at all. Against this backdrop, authorities tried to find at least some connection between the criminal and his victim in order to understand the motive for the attack. For a long time, it was thought this would help uncover Alan's involvement in the crime. It seemed suspicious that Judy called out a similar name before her death. Perhaps she really knew him or was trying to say something else, but her husband did not hear. The closest tie the police found was the period when Jonathan worked as a security guard at the library, where Judy occasionally borrowed books. They both had membership cards for the institution and exchanged pleasantries with each other. However, when questioned, the employees of the library could not remember any incidents involving Jonathan. The staff described Jonathan as a somewhat strange young man. While he worked as a security guard, he had no problems in his service record, at least none were known at his workplace. In fact, during this period, Jonathan had only minor offenses. When they questioned him about his job at the library, he could not recall anything that might connect him to Judy. Eventually, the detectives were forced to admit that this murder was a spontaneous act of aggression against an unknown person and a coincidence with Alan. All suspicions against Alan were dismissed. Jonathan was not familiar with Judy Southern. The choice of victim was random. He was merely driving around the city on his moped, looking for a suitable house to ambush. The Southern house seemed ideal to him, primarily because he spotted an open window that allowed for easy entry. Once inside the house, Jonathan clearly envisioned his actions. He had no specific target and was prepared to shoot whomever entered first, aiming to harm an innocent person. He smoked to ease his nerves. When it became he'd have to wait, he played video games and rummaged through the rooms. He never commented on Judy's abandoned adult toy. When Jonathan discovered that Judy had a husband and a 5-year-old son at the time, he claimed he would have shot any of them without discrimination or hesitation, even a child, if they had entered the house. Jonathan also confessed to abusing a 3-month-old child. Due to the ongoing investigation, he later told the authorities that he did not want to go to jail for child abuse, especially considering the familial ties and age of the victim. He was aware of how badly prisoners with such convictions were treated and described in detail the suffering caused by his fear of incarceration. Therefore, he sought a way to remedy the situation. Jonathan decided to go to jail as a murderer. He likely did not realize that he would be tried for both crimes and face 2 sentences, making it impossible to entirely hide his dark past. While in the ambush house, Jonathan altered his plan and decided to take his own life after committing the murder, so he didn't particularly care about leaving evidence. With these thoughts, he even wrote a suicide note. He spent several days behind bars and eventually told the police, without waiting for his lawyer, that he wanted to officially plead guilty to Judy's murder. Jonathan was not planning to deny his guilt regarding the abuse of a 3-month-old. His conscience was eating away at him, and he was ready to talk to detectives again. The entire local community was shocked by what had happened, especially Melanie, who had already suffered greatly. The media eagerly reported that a 3-month-old baby had been abused by her own father. Authorities feared public unrest and felt compelled to provide increased protection for the criminal. When Melanie learned that her husband was willing to kill any person, even a child, to avoid jail time for his shameful crime, she desperately wanted him imprisoned forever, or better yet, sentenced to death, so that this bloody chaos would end as soon as possible. Given the evidence collected, even without a confession, Jonathan Binney faced little chance of receiving a lenient sentence. He was found guilty of murdering Judy Southern and abusing a baby, receiving the highest punishment before being placed on death row. The court's decision elicited strong reactions from both the killer's wife and the family of the deceased, who finally breathed a sigh of relief and continued to raise their children. Jonathan's lawyer fought for a temporary reprieve, even managing to secure one at first, and subsequently signed a written agreement with the authorities stating that he would never again appeal the sentence if the death penalty were commuted to life imprisonment without the chance of parole. This agreement worked. Jonathan Binney is now serving a life sentence and remains behind bars. The case of Heath Stocks. On January 17, 1997, a man in Lonoke, Arkansas, made what he calls one of the greatest mistakes of his life. 20-year-old Heath Stocks loved his family. One minute he arrived at his family home, the next minute he found his entire family dead on the living room floor. To this day, he claims that his mother and sister always supported him. Although he and his father had a tumultuous relationship, he maintains that they did not deserve to die. This is the story of Heath Stocks, Jack Walls, and the Boy Scouts of America. Lonoke, Arkansas is a quaint town that many would describe as the ideal American life. Like any small town, the residents were family-oriented, and their bonds were tight. The residents of Lonoke held their values close to their chests, and the town became a standout moral compass to those around it. 3 of the most prevalent aspects of Lonoke were its dutiful church scene, appreciation for sports, and love for the Boy Scouts, along with their mantra, respect, honor, and obey. Much like many boys in America, Heath Stocks was a longtime member of the Boy Scouts, eventually reaching the coveted Eagle Scout status. His mother, Barbara, and his sister, Heather, shared a tight bond with him throughout his childhood. The only wedge in this seemingly perfect family life appeared to be his father, Joe. Heather was definitely his protector. She apparently felt very threatened by their father because Heath wasn't going to be the perfect child. Heath did typical kid things and made kid mistakes that were unacceptable to Joe. He struggled with learning disabilities and had ADHD, which affected his ability to get work done at school. Heath and his group had a favorite scoutmaster, Charles Jack Walls III, who was kind and doting. The boys under his care quickly formed a strong bond with Walls. Not only was he a respected father, but the Walls name was well known in Lonoke, thanks to his family's wealth and his father's work as a judge. Everyone wanted to be one of Walls's boys. Stocks himself said in an interview at the time that when people had problems with their boys, Walls always said he could put them in the Scouts and mold them into upstanding young men that their parents could be proud of. The use of the word mold in Stocks' recounting is particularly haunting, considering the context of his case. Walls was not just a guide, he was a leader, a great influence, a savior, as Stocks' grandmother put it. Now, that term drips with painful irony. The people of Lonoke, Arkansas, would look at Jack Walls and describe him as magic. He was a perfect citizen who encouraged young children to be the best they could be, a role model for all. To most, he was the ideal American citizen, the perfect person to look after their children. Unfortunately, that trust would be shattered in one of the most gruesome ways. For many parents of scouts under Walls, he became a confidant for any issues or conflicts. The scouts would report their worries to Walls, and in turn, their parents would seek advice from him. This allowed Walls to insert himself into the family dynamics of countless people. When their parents were not spending time with their children, Walls sometimes took on the role of teacher, introducing them to military skills as they shot guns and hunted. Other times, the topics veered into discussions about alcohol and adult magazine. Two of his scouts, Doug Hogan and Mark McConnell, reported Walls' misconduct to their families in the summer of 1992. Cletus Hogan, Doug Hogan's father, had Jack Walls resign from the Boy Scouts of America after reporting the incident. However, when he turned the case over to the courts, Walls used his reputation and power within the Lonoke community to get the charges dismissed, slandering the Hogan as people who wanted a part of Walls' fortune. Doug Hogan, in turn, became a target for the other boys in the Scouts due to their growing protectiveness of Walls and their newfound skills in firearms. Heath Stocks was one of the boys groomed by Walls during this time. Behind the scenes, Walls began sowing discord between Stocks and Stocks' father, further establishing himself as a father figure in Stocks' life. Joe Stocks, Stocks' father, was distant and often physically disciplined him as a child, so Stocks turned to his trusted scout leader with his boyhood problems, further entrenching himself under Walls' control. When Stocks' mother, Barbara, discovered that he had been assaulted by Walls, she insisted that Stocks file charges against him. However, the charges all but disappeared by the time Stocks entered college. He sought Walls' approval for almost everything he did. Walls had firmly grasped control over Stocks' life, and the turmoil that Stocks experienced would soon come to a head. After Stocks took a weekend off from college, one horrifying day, Barbara walked in on Walls and Stocks together. She never blamed her son, nor did she attempt to interrogate him. She simply went to her pastor to seek advice on the terrifying situation. Stocks inevitably confided in his mother and sister Heather about what had been happening to him. This sent Walls into a frenzy and asked him to solve the problem. After years of insistence that Walls' protection was of the utmost importance, Stocks heard the order and obeyed. On the evening of January 17, 1997, Stocks went to his family home and ransacked it. His sister walked in just as he had his mouth around the barrel of a .45 caliber handgun. Their mother followed her soon after, and then their father seconds later. They were dead. Heath had taken the gun and shot them all. He had killed the problem as ordered. His entire family was dead, and as the courts would soon find, it was entirely his fault. Even if Walls was there to ensure the deed was done, it was Stocks who pulled the trigger. Stocks said he went back into the living room, got on his knees, and stuck his gun in his mouth. About that time, his mom came through, and he saw his dad's face. The next thing he knew, they're all dead. Stocks fled the scene and disposed of his gun in a nearby river. The other items were put inside a dumpster by a Pizza Hut in town. Stocks sought solace at the apartment of a college friend at Henderson State University, where police would find and arrest him at 6 a.m. the next day. Heath Stocks was charged with 3 counts of capital murder. Investigator Steve Finch led the Stocks family murder investigation and conducted several interviews with Stocks to determine the motive for the murders. It was then that Stocks reported the manipulation and abuse he suffered at the hands of his scoutmaster to the police. It was speculated that Walls was even present during the murders, and yet, when Stocks was arrested and sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences, Walls was not brought under investigation. No display of evidence, no calling of witnesses, and no defense whatsoever. The guilty plea, made at Walls' command, provided little reason or purpose. However, Walls would not remain innocent forever. Eventually, an investigation was launched against Walls thanks to the bravery of his own nephew, another victim of Walls. Like the other victims, Wade Knox had a strong relationship with his uncle. Knox joined the Boy Scouts because of Walls' influence and wanted Walls as his troop leader. He was also a part of Stocks' Boy Scout troop. There were many similarities between the young Stocks and Knox, from their upbringing to their personal difficulties, which Walls exploited like a parasite. Karen Knox said of her son, Knox was probably 6 or 7 when he joined the Boy Scouts. He became a Boy Scout because of Walls. Walls was his uncle and encouraged it. It was as normal as it could be. When Knox was 5, she noticed things about him that just weren't right. He had attention deficit issues, he was on medication, and then he was diagnosed with dyslexia. They knew it was going to be hard. By 3rd grade, things fell apart at school. Wade could no longer play sports or get along with anybody. He did not respect authority. It was just constant turmoil. Knox would get so upset that he would run away, and Walls would smooth everything over. They lived right across the street from Walls, and there were always scouts over there. Wade Knox, Walls' nephew, had been abused by his uncle since the age of 7. Reportedly, when Walls was out washing his car, Knox put a gun to Walls' head and forced Walls to confess to Wade's parents that he, his brother, and several other scouts, including Heath, had repeatedly abused by him. Later traumatized by the things Walls had done to him, Wade Knox committed to end his own life. His family started the Wade Knox Children's Advocacy Center in hopes that no other family would have to endure the turmoil they experienced. In hindsight, many people who view the case of the Stocks family murder speculate that Stocks did not act alone and that the trial was mishandled. Many believe that a guilty plea by Stocks would not have been submitted if proper action had been taken by the investigators. These claims, while lacking physical evidence, were supported by the then special prosecutor, Betty Dickey. Due to Wall's influence over the town, the victims' families were not going to file charges and simply allowed Walls to admit himself into a mental health facility. This changed as soon as they learned of the details of what Walls had done to their children. This was when Stocks admitted that Walls had ordered him to kill his parents, claiming Walls was present to ensure it was done. Though in later interviews, Stocks stated he did not remember if anyone else was in the house on the day he killed his family. Eventually, Walls was charged with 6 counts of abuse assault, no penalties in connection with the Stocks family case. He now serves 1 life sentence plus an additional 40 years. Betty Dickey remarked about the incident, they were looking at 50 to 100 young boys over a period of 20 to 30 years that he'd molested. The reason only 6 counts were charged against Walls was due to the statute of limitations. In 2020, Heath Stocks was interviewed by Fox 16 about the murders and the abuse he suffered at the hands of Jack Walls. Surprisingly, he did not blame the Boy Scouts for the abuse, despite their recent bankruptcy and the abuse scandals that had emerged. He did not even blame Walls himself for his parents' deaths. Stocks claims he has forgiven Walls, mainly for his own mental health. Also asserting that although Walls was not responsible for pulling the trigger, he was the reason Stocks' mind had been warped enough to commit such a gruesome act. Stocks also places blame on his parents for insisting that he remain in the Boy Scouts despite several warning signs. Currently, Stocks remains in prison with a lifetime of incarceration ahead of him. If he had not been subjected to such thorough abuse in his childhood years, his family would still be alive today. Stocks had been a victim of gruesome crimes for years, which deteriorated his mental health until he hit rock bottom. 3 of the closest people in his life were dead due to his actions and the abuse of a powerful man. If Jack Walls had not taken the innocence of over 50 young Boy Scouts, much could have been saved and protected. His nephew, Wade Knox, would also be alive. Justice may have been served when Walls received his lifetime sentence, but there are questions that still remain unanswered. The case of Mary Griffiths. In 2009, Mary Griffiths was a 38-year-old woman and the mother of 3 daughters, aged 9, 10, and 13. All 3 children were born during her marriage. However, her relationship with her husband did not last long. By 2007, they had divorced, but they remained on good terms. Mary was granted primary custody of the children while her ex-husband took them on weekends. There were no disputes regarding this arrangement. Mary focused on moving forward and providing for her daughters. She worked hard to ensure they had everything they needed. To save time on commuting and spend more time with her children, she found a job as a fitness instructor at a gym near her rented home. Over time, Mary was able to purchase a house in the small town of Berry Street, Edmonds, UK. Her life seemed to be improving more and more. Mary decided to try building a relationship again. With her good looks, attractiveness, and great physical shape, she felt confident that finding a partner wouldn't be a problem. Thanks to her outgoing personality and striking appearance, she quickly caught the attention of John McFarlane. They met during a time when both were searching for new jobs. As they got to know each other, they discovered a shared passion for martial arts, sports, and similar perspectives on life. Over time, Mary and John began taking the same fitness classes. They both became instructors at the same fitness center. Despite some clear differences between them, they connected easily. They began spending more time together, commuting to work, having lunch, and hanging out after their shifts. John even covered for Mary at work when she couldn't make it. However, for Mary, the relationship was just a friendship. Mary is outgoing, so she easily connects with people, including John. She considers him a friend and firmly believes their relationship is purely platonic. When speaking with her family and friends, she often emphasizes that there is absolutely no possibility of a romantic relationship between her and John, partly because he is married. Unfortunately, John saw things differently. He interpreted Mary's friendliness and conversations with him as a sign that they could become a couple. Deeply infatuated with her, he began to romanticize their interactions. Mary's behavior only reinforced his feelings. For years after they became friends, Mary helped organize John's 40th birthday party. John misinterpreted this gesture as something deeply personal, an indication that she had romantic feelings for him, which only reinforced his certainty about his feelings for her. John was naturally introverted and had little experience with women who offered him the kind of warmth and care that Mary did. His marriage had grown cold over time, so Mary's attitude felt especially significant to him. After the birthday party, he started dreaming of a life with her by his side. These fantasies quickly turned into an obsession, despite him still being married. He began discussing with his friends the possibility of divorcing his wife to pursue Mary. Mary, however, was unaware of his feelings. A few months later, she started dating someone else, which shocked and disappointed him. Mary was happy in her new relationship and openly shared details with him, not realizing the emotional pain it caused. For him, the situation became deeply traumatic. Resentment and anger built up over time, eventually becoming impossible for him to contain. Mary shared a post about her boyfriend on social media, and that was when the problem started. John responded to the post by leaving angry messages. He insulted Mary and made baseless accusations, including infidelity and a reckless lifestyle, none of which were true. John's behavior grew increasingly obsessive, and he started attempting to intimidate Mary through frequent and unsettling phone calls. Mary started to notice that John would appear at places she visited, even though he had no reason to know her whereabouts. Their interactions dwindled, and the distance between them grew, but John was clearly unhappy about this. The tension escalated further as he bombarded her with daily phone calls. His erratic behavior began to strain her relationship with her new boyfriend. Mary's friends and family observed that John acted as though they had been in a romantic relationship and believed she had betrayed him. He seemed consumed by these imagined scenarios, leading to ongoing dissatisfaction and aggression. Although John's actions were not illegal, Mary had made it clear on multiple occasions that she only considered him a friend and never intended for their relationship to be more than platonic. Unfortunately, John's perception of the situation did not align with reality. Mary grew increasingly anxious due to John's troubling behavior. Fearing his aggression, she avoided public places in the city, worried she might encounter him. Her fears escalated when an intruder entered her home late at night and slashed all 4 tires on her car. She suspected that John was responsible. She was convinced he wanted to sabotage her relationship with her new boyfriend, leaving her isolated. His interference was successful when he spread false information about her, ultimately causing her and her boyfriend to break up. Mary was devastated by the breakup, while John felt triumphant. Misinterpreting her distress, he believed she was now available and ready to be with him. He saw her resistance as playful teasing, deluding himself with fantasies about their connection. Feeling haunted, John took a drastic step. After learning that Mary had broken up with her boyfriend, he immediately went to court to file for divorce from his wife. Although they had been married for over 20 years, John was determined to leave and start a new life with another woman. This became particularly troubling when Mary found out. She couldn't understand where he was getting his ideas or what was influencing his decisions. The entire situation deeply unsettled her. Seeking advice, she often spoke with her relatives, who encouraged her to contact the police. Mary had enough evidence to take action against him, but her doing so only escalated the situation. John began bombarding Mary with calls and messages. In each message, he expressed his intense emotions, insisting they could be incredibly happy together if she agreed. He claimed Mary had feelings for him that she was suppressing, urging her to be honest and embrace them so they could pursue a life together. However, Mary had no such intentions. In one conversation, she firmly stated that they were just friends and that she had no plans to take their relationship beyond that. This upset John, as his perspective on friendship was different from Mary's. Yet, he couldn't resist trying to become more involved in her life. Although she rejected all his romantic advances, she still maintained their friendship. It seemed she pitied him, and perhaps even feared that ending their connection would lead to serious problems. Mary hoped to continue the relationship peacefully. He, however, took every opportunity to be near her, visiting her home frequently, and she always let him in. During these visits, he repeatedly made advances, such as attempting to kiss her when they sat together on the couch. Mary consistently rejected him, but he persisted. Mary considered ending the meetings, but John then used his cleverness to get closer to her daughters. He bonded with them, spending quality time together, and they began asking when he would visit again. After John's divorce, he spent almost all his free time with Mary and her children, as though he were waiting for them to invite him to live with them. Meanwhile, Mary's relationship with her ex-boyfriend remained unresolved. Both she and her ex had doubts and considered rekindling their relationship. However, those doubts were primarily rooted in John's behavior, making them uncertain about the possibility of being together again. Whenever John sees Mary and her ex-boyfriend together, he gets angry and often has aggressive outbursts. On one occasion, he lost control entirely. Still, she tried to remain patient, while John blamed her for the breakup of his relationship. Eventually, she asked her ex-boyfriend to visit her home more frequently to help her and her children feel safer during those moments. When John found out, he reacted badly. He began posting misleading content on social media, claiming he was in a relationship with Mary. Tired of the situation, she decided to put an end to it. She left a comment under the post, clearly stating that there was no relationship between them. In this situation, the most reasonable thing for John to do is leave Mary alone and focus on his life, allowing her to mend her relationship with her ex-boyfriend. However, John went to Mary's house again instead. By exploiting her sympathy, he convinced her to let him in. Mary, having a kind heart and considering him a friend, allowed him to stay the night, offering him the couch. It was a stormy evening, and she didn't have it in her to leave him out in the bad weather. He appealed to her compassion, reminding her of his struggles after being kicked out by his wife. The arrangement was that he would sleep on the couch, and the next morning, after the children left for school, they would discuss and clarify the situation. For John, it was all just a game. That same night, he attempted to seduce Mary. Mary, however, believed that he stood in her doorway at night, watching her as she slept. At the time, she was in bed with her youngest daughter, who was afraid to sleep alone in her room. She woke up feeling unnerved by his unsettling gaze. She began yelling at him to go away, which woke the children. The incident led to another heated outburst, during which John accused his friend of giving false hope only to crush it for his own amusement. Afterwards, John left, but things took an even darker turn. He started posting alarming content on his social media accounts, talking about death and hinting at ending his life. He also shared these thoughts with many of his friends. At one point, he even shared a disturbing photo of himself standing next to a noose in a barn, as if he were preparing to follow through on his threats. His actions escalated further when he attempted to swallow sleeping pills on 2 separate occasions in a short time span, both of which required medical intervention. On May 3, 2009, John's behavior had become so troubling that Mary insisted he see a psychiatrist. His friends, including his ex-wife, agreed with her. However, the psychiatrist could not diagnose John with any mental disorders and concluded that he was not a danger to himself or others. This misjudgment would prove to be the first in a series of tragic mistakes with devastating consequences. It seemed that John was aware of the issues he was facing and became distressed when the doctors decided not to treat him or admit him to a psychiatric clinic. This news deeply frightened Mary. She felt threatened, worried for the girls around her, and helpless in the face of this danger. On May 5, 2009, Mary's worst fears began to come true. That day, she called emergency services at 999. She told the operator that her friend, John, was acting erratically and appeared to have gone crazy. His alarming behavior left her anxious and unsure of how to handle the situation. Mary explained his history of stalking, his inappropriate actions, and his references to ending his life. Despite these concerns, the operator assessed the situation as non-urgent, indicating a response time of 1 to 4 hours, as all officers were occupied. Mary was informed that a police officer would only be able to visit her the following morning. The operator advised her to call again if the situation escalated, promising a faster response in that case. However, Mary had valid reasons for her initial call. On that day, John attacked her for the first time, exploiting his knowledge of her vulnerabilities. Injured in the attack, she sought treatment for her leg at the hospital. But upon returning home, she found John waiting for her. He was relentless, always lingering near her, pretending to support her, and trying to convince her that she could not live without him. The situation became so dire that when Mary was putting her daughters to bed, the girls were deeply afraid that John might return and harm their mother, possibly taking her away forever. John, finally driven away, was furious. He sent Mary a threatening message, feeling rejected and vowing revenge. Those who knew him were deeply concerned about his behavior and even alerted the police. For instance, Mary's friend called emergency services at around 6:30 p.m. that same day, expressing worry about John's mental state due to his volatile actions. Despite clear evidence of John's dangerous behavior, the authorities failed to take Mary's friend's warning seriously or consider the urgency of her earlier call. Much later, close to midnight, John himself made another call to the police to report a robbery. This ensured that the officers would respond to his call, giving him the opportunity to go to Mary's house. Before leaving, he sent a message to his wife, expressing that he still loved her but blaming her for their problems and the breakup with Mary. He ended the message with an ominous and ambiguous note, suggesting he planned to resolve matters once and for all. John armed himself with an axe and a specialized weapon used for slaughtering cattle, then headed toward Mary's house. At the time, Mary was resting with her children, completely unaware of the impending danger. Around midnight, John arrived at her house, standing near the back door. He used the axe to break in, then threw it in the kitchen. He proceeded to locate the fuse box, which he knew from previous visits, and cut off the electricity to the entire house. With the power out, he climbed the stairs to the second floor. Mary was asleep in her room with her 10-year-old daughter but woke up when she heard someone entering. Confused, she tried to turn on the light and realized it wasn't working. In a moment of terror, she recognized who the intruder must be. Before she could act, John attacked her. He began hitting her and dragged her out of the bed onto the floor, where he pinned her down and started choking her. The commotion woke up all the children in the house. They tried to resist John, but he was much stronger than they were. He injured 2 children and attacked Mary, aiming for her chest. She managed to dodge, but the bullet hit her shoulder, leaving her wounded. This escalated into a desperate fight for survival. Despite her injury, she fought back with all her strength. Realizing she couldn't overpower him, she decided to reach the street, hoping to draw him away from the children and call for help. Mary's 2 daughters were injured and unable to resist any longer, and Mary tried her best to protect them. John attempted to strangle her but failed. Injured and desperate, she struggled to make her way to the front door. She managed to run down the stairs and out onto the street, screaming for help. Her cries caught the attention of the neighbors, who began coming outside to see what was going on. Several witnesses saw John holding a weapon, which he pointed at Mary's chest as she stood terrified. In front of everyone, including children, he attacked twice. Among the neighbors was an off-duty policeman who had been at home resting. The officer approached John, trying to calm him down and reason with him. Without hesitation, he aimed the weapon at the officer, threatening to attack. Unarmed, the policeman raised his hands and retreated, a move that likely saved his life. Afterward, John struck Mary's youngest daughter and fled the scene. Among the neighbors were doctors who attempted to assist Mary while waiting for an ambulance, but tragically, their efforts were in vain. She passed away. 2 of her daughters required hospital treatment, though their injuries were not severe, at least physically. Thankfully, the situation did not escalate to the worst-case scenario. Later, it was revealed that John's original plan was not to harm Mary but to target her children. However, his plan didn't go as intended. He had also planned to take his own life in Mary's home to ensure she lived with the resulting trauma. He shared this sinister plan with a friend through a messaging app, explaining that this was his idea of revenge for Mary breaking his heart. Sadly, the friend dismissed these remarks and did not intervene, merely advising John to return to his wife and calm down. After attacking Mary, John immediately wrote to the same friend and confessed what he had done. He was later found bleeding near the house where he had been living for the past few weeks. Upon returning to the house, he attempted to end his life by cutting his wrist but was rescued in time. After regaining consciousness, he claimed to experience memory lapses. He stated that he recalled multiple attempts to end his life, including one just before his arrest. John told the police about his relationship with Mary, describing how she had rejected and betrayed him. Vaguely, he remembered fragments of their fight and the attack, but most of his memories were missing. While it appeared that he may have been in a state of emotional distress, the detectives believed he was feigning mental health issues to avoid responsibility for his actions. Their suspicions were reinforced by evidence that John had carefully planned the crime. He had shared the plan with a friend, said goodbye to his ex-wife, and even contacted the authorities beforehand to delay their arrival. John took weapons from the farm where he worked and spent additional time at the fitness center prior to committing the crime. This further demonstrates that his actions were intentional, in contrast to those of individuals suffering from severe mental illnesses. Predictably, the defense attorney argued that John suffered from a mental disorder and had endured a difficult childhood. Following this argument, John was sent for a psychiatric evaluation, which confirmed that he had a severe form of depressive disorder. Despite receiving this diagnosis, he did not admit guilt, claiming that he could not remember anything. Initially, the prosecution aimed to prove premeditated murder in court, but this course of action was eventually deemed unnecessary. After assessing all relevant factors, John's lawyer advised him to accept responsibility. John changed his testimony and pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter, although he maintained that much of what had occurred was beyond his memory. For Mary's family, this confession brought some degree of relief. Nevertheless, they were compelled to endure the hearing, during which they agonizingly learned the harrowing details of Mary's final moments. John McFarland received a sentence of life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 20 years. Typically, parole for such crimes is not considered until after 30 years. However, the court reduced the minimum term to 20 years, citing confirmed mental health issues as a mitigating factor. Mary's family was outraged that the court had considered John's mental health as justification for a reduced sentence. They strongly believed that John deserved a far harsher punishment, arguing that he not only killed Mary but also posed a serious threat to others, including her children. In their view, John should remain isolated from society permanently. The family testified to John's obsessive and dangerous behavior, presenting evidence that he had initially planned to harm the children. Ultimately, it appeared that Mary's desperate struggle with John had diverted his attention away from the children, but at the cost of her own life. Due to the persistent efforts of Mary's family, the case was reviewed. As a result, John's minimum sentence of 20 years was increased to the standard 30 years. Following the retrial, the senior investigator approached Mary and expressed hope that the revised decision and extended sentence would provide her greater comfort. However, the matter did not end there. Mary's children, Sophie, the youngest, turned 18, Hannah, 19, and Jessica, 22, jointly decided to pursue accountability for those they believed had contributed to John's attack. They held the police department, specifically the dispatcher, and the psychiatrist who had deemed John sane and failed to mandate psychiatric treatment, responsible for their perceived negligence. They argued that if the danger posed by John had been fully understood, Mary might still be alive. This seemed logical, as even a brief conversation with a psychiatrist, who had evaluated John after his arrest, reportedly revealed signs of mental illness. Serious psychological issues had clearly been overlooked, and it remained unclear why 2 previous hospital tests had failed to detect similar problems. It became evident that the response to calls placed by Mary and her friend, made only half an hour apart, was inadequate. The dispatcher underestimated the severity of the situation, which they believed to be the main reason the police failed to respond in time to prevent the tragedy. This failure prompted revisions to several regulations aimed at improving threat detection and enhancing police procedures. It was decided that law enforcement officers had fulfilled everything correctly within the regulations. However, Sophie, Hannah, and Jessica do not lose hope that their efforts were not in vain and that this will at least help save the lives of other victims. The case of Michelle Kitterman. When a person capable of betrayal appears in a circle of close friends, this clearly cannot lead to anything good, especially if a love triangle is involved. Lacey Hurst Pavick was born in 1974 in Tonasket, Washington State, a tiny town with a population located south of the Canadian border. Her family owned the largest and most popular restaurant in the city, which made them local celebrities. They were quite wealthy, everyone in the city knew and respected them, some were even afraid of them. According to eyewitnesses, Lacey always had trouble making friends. Many children avoided her because she belonged to a privileged background. However, this did not particularly worry Lacey. She had a narrow circle of trusted friends. In high school, Lacey dated boys but only experienced real feelings when she met a young man named Brandon. At least, that was her first love, which eventually developed into marriage. Unfortunately, this relationship did not last long. After some time, Lacey and Brandon decided to get a divorce, with Lacey being the initiator. They then began a fight for sole custody of their children. Lacey's influential family managed to provide her with the best divorce lawyer, and the children remained with her. According to Lacey, the reason for the separation was constant quarrels with her husband, although the specifics were never disclosed. Nevertheless, it was believed that her husband was a decent person who never raised a hand against her. After the divorce, Lacey got a job as a financial director at a car dealership, where she met a man named Danny Pavick. Danny was quite an attractive bachelor, well known in the city and a favorite among women. Many wanted to build a relationship with him, but he, by his own admission, was only interested in wealthy Lacey. Danny warmly accepted her and her children. Their relationship before the wedding lasted almost 8 years, and finally, Lacey had everything she had dreamed of: a family, a new husband, a home, and a career. Despite being very busy, Lacey always found time to relax with her husband, friends, or relatives. Danny was drawn to her cheerful life and willingly participated in various events. Among the regular members of their social circle were friends from high school, including one of Lacey's few friends, Tansy. Tansy was known as a party girl, which made her hesitant to make friendships. She was also involved in distributing illegal substances and loved to throw parties wherever she went. Tansy had a large circle of friends and acquaintances, also from the same town, Michelle Kitterman. She was born on May 12, 1983, alongside her twin sister, Danielle Kitterman. They was born into a loving family and initially lived in Richland, Washington. The sisters shared a very close relationship, and they also had an older sister named Melinda. Despite being born prematurely, the twins grew up healthy in Benton City, Washington, after moving there due to their father's work. Michelle was an energetic, independent girl who wanted to explore the world and build a career. While not particularly interested in family, She was open to having children. Seeking a better life, Michelle moved to Virginia and lived in Maryland for some time. This was during her work in the modeling industry, as her looks were noticed during her senior year in high school. She occasionally received good photography offers. However, everything changed on May 23, 2003, when Michelle, then 20 years old, found herself in a difficult situation. The boy she was seeing abandoned her when he learned she was pregnant. In 2008, the Kitterman family faced their first shock when the twins' father passed away after a long illness. By October of that year, Michelle decided to move back closer to her family. She had always participated in shows, performed in groups, and loved the stage, but what amazed everyone the most was her beauty. Her modeling career was gaining momentum, and many believed she had a bright future ahead until Michelle got pregnant. Initially, she planned to continue with her modeling career, but now her priorities shifted. She wanted to be a good mother. To stay afloat, Michelle began working part-time in various fields, such as being a waitress or a bartender. It was a tough period, but she eventually secured a job as an administrator at a local private clinic. Michelle was described as a very hard-working, kind mother, remained young, easy, going, and lively. In November 2008, Tansy and Michelle attended a big city party where Michelle caught Danny Pavek's attention. They talked all evening and found it hard to stop. By the end of the night, both realized they were in love with each other. They began to meet secretly despite Danny's marriage to Lacey. He would tell his wife that he was out with friends or working late, but in reality, he was with Michelle. He spent time with Lacey while at home, often stayed late after work, walking until late with friends. He had a wide circle of friends, and Lacey did not suspect that her husband could have an affair, as she trusted him completely. One day, a friend visited Lacey, hoping to catch her at home without Danny. She disclosed Danny's betrayal, which was a real blow for Lacey. However, she composed herself, understanding the small town dynamics and how well known their family was, amidst numerous rumors. Lacey expected that this was just another piece of gossip, but days later, Danny confessed. He revealed that he was torn in a love triangle and couldn't choose between the two women. He decided that revealing his secret relationship to his wife would help him break free from the emotional turmoil. Danny admitted that he had been seeing his mistress for several months. And shortly before these events, Michelle became pregnant, which added to the confusion. He shared every detail, including how he met Michelle at the party. He claimed that Tansy introduced them and was the catalyst for his subsequent betrayals. Obviously, he sought to absolve himself of responsibility for his infidelity. After his confession, Lacey threatened to divorce him if he didn't leave his mistress. However, during this time, Michelle was doing the same. She saw Danny as an excellent candidate for a husband and father for her child. Furthermore, Michelle hoped that this new relationship would help her achieve a stable life, which she felt was necessary for her happiness. Although rumors suggested that Danny did not work and lived off his wife, he found himself in a very difficult situation. Lacey demanded that he make a choice, but for Danny, this was a big problem since he liked both women. He had to decide whether to continue living in a marriage with his wealthy wife and children or to leave for his beautiful young mistress. Several days passed during which he shared his internal conflict with friends, claiming that he had decided to leave his family and was going to tell his wife. Lacey was desperate not to lose her beloved husband and was willing to do whatever it took to keep him. On March 1, 2009, a woman contacted the police station of a neighboring city, reporting that she had found the body of a girl who was covered in blood. When the police arrived, they found the deceased in terrible condition on a deserted road in a remote area of the city. The girl was half naked, lying on her jacket and covered in blood. Her hair was tangled in the barbed wire of a fence along the road. Initially, the cause of death was unclear. Detectives believed that the girl could have gotten lost, was frozen and disoriented due to hypothermia. She might have fallen onto the barbed wire. The police suspected intoxication or the use of illegal substances, but subsequent toxicological examinations did not confirm these suspicions. Further analysis revealed that she was a victim of murder. The unidentified body showed no signs of life and had extensive injuries. The forensic expert counted 39 stab wounds that were unusually shaped, clearly not inflicted by a simple kitchen knife. The victim received deep stab wounds from a weapon resembling an ice pick. These peculiar wounds were concentrated in the neck and abdomen areas, with a large amount of blood around the body, indicating that the victim had put up significant resistance. Identifying the body proved difficult since documents were not found with her. Witnesses insisted that the girl was not a local resident. The only valuable clue was a tattoo on the deceased's body. The police photographed the tattoo and began checking missing persons reports from nearby cities. One of the first cases that caught the detectives' attention was a report from Michelle Kitterman's mother. When shown a photograph of the tattoo, she immediately recognized her daughter, making it evident that the deceased was Michelle, who was in the early weeks of her pregnancy. Condition of the body indicating a personal motive from the killer, possibly jealousy, revenge, or insult. The nature of the injuries suggested that they were likely inflicted by more than one person. The investigators concluded that the crime had likely been committed by a group. Consequently, the police began to investigate Michelle's immediate social circle to understand who could have perpetrated this brutal attack. In their inquiries, they spoke extensively with Michelle's loved ones. Tracy, in particular, mentioned Danny Pavek when asked about Michelle's complicated relationships. She was aware of the love triangle in which Michelle found herself and knew about her daughter's pregnancy. Michelle had expressed her desire to keep the baby and to pursue a life with Danny, aiming to take him away from Lacey, who he had been seeing on the side for several months. Despite the fact that he had the same motive for the murder, wanting to get rid of the annoying mistress and save his marriage with a wealthy wife, this version of events needed to be checked. The investigators first went to the house where he lived with his wife and children. Contrary to expectations, Danny had an alibi during the attack. He was at home with his wife. Lacey was also questioned. She was at home when the police arrived, behaved very calmly, and admitted that she knew about her husband's affair and that his mistress was pregnant. Lacey did not hide her distress over these facts but insisted that they were working on their marriage and trying to save it, that she had nothing to do with Michelle's murder. The detectives didn't notice anything suspicious, so they were forced to leave empty-handed. The police continued their investigation, needing to talk to a dozen more people from the deceased's closest circle of friends. 2 days later, Lacey called the station and admitted that she had a theory about who could be guilty of this bloody massacre. She referred to Tansy. According to Lacey, Michelle had been planning to report Tansy to the police for selling illegal substances for a long time. Lacey believed that Michelle was a police informant, giving Tansy a good reason to get rid of her. However, she could not provide any confirmation of this. This information needed to be checked. Before the police had time to investigate Lacey's claims, another call came into the station. A young man contacted them, saying that he had information for the police but would only share it if he was provided protection. He was seriously afraid for his life because the killers were dangerous people and would inevitably take revenge upon learning what he was going to do. The caller knew that not long ago, a girl had been beaten to death with an ice pick. Since no information about the murder weapon had been published, it was obvious that this was a valuable witness. The informant also referred to Tansy Mathis, mentioning that she sold banned substance and had repeatedly hired people if she faced any problems with her business. This allowed her to collect debts and remove unwanted competitors. The caller knew this well because he had once worked part-time as her personal security guard. However, he assured them that he was not involved in the attack, but he knew who they should investigate closely. According to him, Tansy had hired another individual known in criminal circles as Hollywood, who was supposed to deal with Michelle. The informant indicated that the ice pick had not been randomly chosen. It was provided by a man named David Richards. Of all the names mentioned, the detectives were most interested in Hollywood. After checking the databases, the police managed to locate a man named Brent Phillips, known as Hollywood. The alleged mastermind was arrested first. Brent was found in a rehabilitation center, where he was apparently seeking refuge from police persecution. He denied any wrongdoing, claiming to have had no idea about his actions and expressed that they had no serious motive to deal so cruelly with a pregnant young woman. Nevertheless, it was evident that Tansy was clearly lying because she knew Michelle. It seemed that the police had seasoned criminals in their hands who would not be easy to crack. Yet, contrary to expectations, just 4 days after the arrest, the alleged killer agreed to cooperate with the police. The reason for this, he claimed, was that he did not have enough money after the murder. The suspicions were confirmed. He had indeed participated in the massacre, but he had never been paid for the crime. After violating the terms of his agreement, he decided to cooperate and turn in the mastermind, hoping to receive leniency during sentencing. Brent said that he knew in advance what Tansy intended to do because she might not be able to manage on her own. Therefore, a strong accomplice was necessary. Tansy had convinced several more people in advance, telling them the story that Michelle wanted to cooperate with the police and would hand over the gang. On the evening of Michelle's murder, Tansy, David Richards, and Brent came for their victim, inviting her to go out for a supposedly fun night at a casino. Michelle, who knew these people well, readily agreed, falling into their trap. The group headed towards the gambling establishment, choosing a deserted road outside the city. Instead of going to the casino, however, they drove 50 kilometers away from the city and suddenly pulled over, suggesting that Michelle stop to smoke. She agreed, but after they stopped, they dragged her out into the snow and began to beat her with an ice pick. The first few blows to the stomach were made by Tansy, then she handed the ice pick to Brent because the tool was too heavy for her. Brent himself inflicted many more wounds on the defenseless Michelle. The overall story seemed plausible, but the investigators were still interested in confirming the details. Why was Tansy so angry at her old friend and her unborn child? The first blows of the killer were not made by chance. They were precisely aimed at the stomach, yet Tansy stubbornly remained silent. Analyzing the words of the murderer, the detectives quickly realized that the car in which the company was traveling that evening did not belong to any of them. Everyone had other cars. The brand was identified, indicating that the transport for this trip was rented, but they did not know from whom exactly. The detectives began to investigate the car and managed to find a receipt for the rental. The managers showed the recordings from the surveillance cameras, which indicated that Lacey rented the car in her own name. In addition, she worked there, so she was unmistakably recognized. This made her the main suspect as the jealous wife seeking retribution. Rumors reached the investigators that Lacey had repeatedly spoken unflatteringly about Michelle. She stated how she wished her husband's mistress would disappear along with the child. Naturally, she had the most compelling motive for committing the crime, but it was not possible to connect the daughter of an influential family with the bloody massacre, at least until investigators found her at the car dealership. So, Lacey added to list of potential suspects. Curiously, bail amounts of $1 million were set for the other detainees, which no one could pay, while only $250,000 was set for Lacey. Everyone thought this was connected to her powerful family, which especially outraged the victim's family. This decision was a real shock. Michelle's mother and sisters thought that this could be a conspiracy and that they were all in danger. Trials against each of the criminals began, starting with Brent's hearing on charges of first-degree murder of Michelle and first-degree assault on her unborn baby. Phillips was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to 26 years in prison. At the trial, Brent admitted that Tansy turned him against Michelle by telling him that Michelle will report him to the police because he is involved in banned substance trafficking. A similar situation occurred with a third accomplice. The lie worked with all of this. Tansy was found guilty of first-degree murder and first-degree manslaughter due to the fact that the unborn child died. It was believed that she inflicted the deepest blows with an ice pick that injured the baby. In addition, she was charged with first-degree kidnapping and concealment of material evidence. The punishment chosen was life imprisonment without the right to parole. Furthermore, for all the crimes committed, Tansy received additional sentences under other charges, totaling 19 years. Tansy admitted that she had committed the crime at Lacey's request, while her accomplice David Richards, who provided assistance, received 17 years in prison for complicity in the murder. All these hearings went fairly quickly, but Lacey's case stalled from the very beginning. The lawyer insisted that she did not want to kill anyone, but only intended to intimidate the homewrecker. The murder occurred because the criminals could not control the situation. She continued to claim that it was Tansy who initiated the attack because Michelle planned to report her illicit activities to the police. Lacey removed all responsibility from herself, denying any connection to the criminal acts. Lacey's defense immediately went to work and repeatedly delayed the hearings, prolonging the defendant's freedom. This made the situation even more tense because Lacey had rented a car, what rich woman would rent a car for? All this raised serious doubts. Recordings of telephone conversations between the participants in the conspiracy were analyzed, confirming that Lacey and Tansy called each other many times on the night of the crime. This clearly did not happen by coincidence. Additionally, even during her initial communication with the police, Lacey openly expressed her dislike for Michelle and stated that she wanted her mistress to disappear from their lives forever. Interestingly, when the detectives decided to talk to Lacey's husband, Danny, who started this love triangle, it turned out that he was on the run. This went on for about a week, leading to an arrest warrant being issued for him. It was believed that he was also an accomplice in the conspiracy. At the time of his arrest, Danny Pavek was unemployed. While on the run, he got by with odd jobs. Despite plans to leave Lacey, his alleged complicity was never confirmed by the Supreme Court, which made the case quite confusing. Only a year and a half after Michelle's death, the trial of Lacey began on November 10, 2010. After 5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict against Tansy Mathis. She is charged with aggravated first-degree murder of Michelle Kitterman and first-degree manslaughter for killing Michelle's unborn child. In December 2010, she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The very next day after the verdict was passed, Lacey filed an appeal, insisting that the prosecution was biased, her privacy was violated during the collection of evidence, and she pointed out other inconsistencies and violations, none of which were confirmed or were insignificant in light of the crime committed. Her last appeal was rejected in June 2012. Lacey remains behind bars at the Washington Correctional Center for Women. Tansy, David, and Brent are also still in the correctional facility. They will be eligible for parole in 2041. Lacey's mother wrote a book detailing her misadventures connected with her daughter's life imprisonment. However, this book did not achieve much popularity. The case of Marina Diaz-Vallecillos. Marina Diaz-Vallecillos was born on December 24, 2002, in Granada, Andalusia, Spain. She grew up in Granada with her mother, Teresa Vallecillos, and her 4 sisters, Alba, Andrea, Lucia, and Alejandra. Marina was a sociable girl who enjoyed spending time with her friends. Her sister, Andrea, shared that, after finishing high school, she started working at a pharmacy, although it is unclear how she got the job. Her life took a significant turn at the age of 16. At that time, she met a woman named Yasmina, who was born in the late 1980s and was nearly twice her age. However, Marina's family has been strongly opposed to the relationship from the beginning. Since Marina and Yasmina started dating in 2019, the family has been concerned, and her mother has always lived in a state of insecurity. Teresa reported Yasmina to the police several times, fearing for her daughter's safety. Marina was a gentle, sweet, and calm person, which made her family worry that she might be vulnerable to Yasmina's manipulation. It is unclear whether the police took any action regarding these reports, but it is certain that Marina and Yasmina's relationship persisted, with Yasmina displaying increasingly aggressive behavior. Marina confided all the details of her relationship to her mother and sisters, leaving them deeply worried, as Yasmina was extremely cruel. Yasmina repeatedly cut Marina's hair without any reason and used psychological violence by threatening her and attempting to kick her out of the house. Despite this, Yasmina did not want to end the relationship. Yasmina told Marina that if they ever broke up, she would burn down her house and harm all of Marina's relatives. Such a volatile situation was bound to have dire consequences. According to Marina's cousin, Shumar, the reason Marina never reported Yasmina's abusive behavior was her fear of Yasmina's reaction and potential retaliation. What mattered most to Marina was ensuring the safety of her family and avoiding putting them in danger. Over time, as Yasmina and Marina began living together, the violence escalated, resulting in severe social isolation. By early 2021, after being together for roughly a year and a half, they relocated to an undisclosed location, choosing not to share the address with Marina's family. Teresa, the mother of Marina, shared that they felt powerless because they were unable to locate their daughter or provide support. Conflicting information from acquaintances only complicates the situation further, leaving Teresa uncertain about whether they live in a house or an apartment, or even about the exact area of the city where they are located. Teresa lived in constant fear, unable to contact her daughter and worried something terrible might happen. Tragically, on April 13, 2021, her worst fears came true. At around 3 p.m., Yasmina appeared at the police station in Motril, a city on the Mediterranean coast in Grenada, and confessed to the crime. Yasmina told the police that the prior day, while she and Marina were at their rented home, a heated argument broke out between them after breakfast. According to Yasmina, Marina eventually took a knife and threatened her, stating that she could no longer endure their relationship after a year and a half of suffering from both mental and physical abuse. Yasmina claimed she believed Marina would attack her with the knife, prompting her to seize the weapon and strike first. Yasmina explained that Marina had begun screaming and calling for help from the landlord, who happened to be their neighbor. However, before anyone could intervene or understand what was happening, Yasmina threw Marina to the floor and continued stabbing her. After realizing that Marina had died, Yasmina decided not to seek help. Instead, she attempted to cover up the crime by wrapping Marina's body in a sheet, taking a shower, and thoroughly cleaning the entire apartment with cleaning products to erase any evidence. Yasmina disposed of the knife by throwing it into a garbage container along the road leading to the village of Gorgarca, located in the municipality of Veles de Benadal. Around 5 p.m., Yasmina went to the port of Motril to meet her friend Antonio Manuel, to whom she confessed the murder. She asked for his assistance in finding a place to bury Marina's body. Consequently, Antonio was accused of being an accessory to the crime due to his involvement in the incident following the murder. Initially, Yasmina insisted that she had sought his help. Later, when Antonio was arrested, Yasmina changed her statement, claiming she had only sought emotional support from him during a difficult time. Following Yasmina's confession, the authorities went to the apartment she shared with Marina, where the crime had taken place. Inside, they found Marina's body wrapped in a blanket. Investigators confirmed Yasmina's account, noting that the apartment had been meticulously cleaned, leaving behind no visible evidence of the crime, apart from a strong smell of cleaning products. Due to challenges in collecting evidence, assistance was requested from a specialized unit of the National Police in Motril, experts in detecting altered crime scene traces. This team arrived in Grenada on April 14, 2021, shortly after Marina's remains were transported to the city's Anatomical Institute, where all necessary tests were conducted. The results revealed that Marina had died from 24 stab wounds inflicted by Yasmina using a sharp object. It was also determined that Marina, aged 18, had suffered over 20 blows and other injuries to various parts of her body. On April 16, 4 days after the crime, the Court of First Instance No. 3 in Motril ordered Yasmina to be held in pretrial custody without bail. Despite her lack of prior criminal record, the Supreme Court of Andalusia stated that this decision aimed to protect the investigation and prevent her from fleeing. On the same day, the court decided to temporarily release Antonio Manuel, initially suspected of helping conceal the crime, as a precautionary measure. Because no formal request for his arrest had been made, he was required to report to the authorities every Tuesday, and his passport was confiscated. On the same day, the government of Grenada announced that the case would be treated as an instance of domestic violence since Yasmina and Marina had been living together. Although the authorities acted swiftly, the trial did not commence until December 13, 2022. Friends and family of Marina gathered outside the court, shouting and demanding justice for the young woman who had tragically lost her life shortly after she had turned 18. During the trial, Marina's family lawyer, Jesus Huertos, highlighted the brutal nature of Yasmina's actions, detailing the extensive injuries Marina had suffered. He said that Yasmina deserved a life sentence but should still be given the opportunity to rehabilitate. Additionally, Marina's psychologist, who also counseled her mother, Teresa, testified in court. The psychologist revealed that Marina had repeatedly expressed her fear of Yasmina's violent behavior and had stated that she no longer wanted to continue the relationship. Other witnesses provided statements backing this narrative. The prosecution argued that Yasmina had intentionally prolonged Marina's suffering before carrying out the killing, emphasizing the cruelty of the act. However, unlike the family's lawyer, the prosecution did not seek a life sentence. Instead, they recommended a 17-year prison term. The defense attorney representing Yasmina argued that she had been in poor physical and mental condition at the time of the crime. On that day, she had allegedly taken antidepressants while also consuming illegal substances, which impaired her perception of reality. According to the lawyer, Yasmina reacted violently when Marina expressed her desire to leave the house and approached her with a knife. The lawyer asserted that Yasmina was unable to fully comprehend her actions and requested her acquittal during the initial hearing. During the trial, Yasmina expressed remorse, acknowledging the difficulty she had in understanding her actions, while admitting her awareness of the gravity of the crime. She revealed that her decision to surrender to the authorities stemmed from her realization that Marina did not deserve to be buried in an unmarked, improvised grave. Yasmina explained that her intent was not only to ensure Marina received a proper burial but also to take responsibility for her actions. However, she insisted that she never intended to harm her partner, claiming her actions were meant to protect Marina instead. These statements conflicted with testimony from Marina's relatives as well as Yasmina's initial statements. In early March 2023, a provisional court in Granada sentenced Yasmina to 17 years in prison for murder, taking into account mitigating factors such as her relationship with Marina and her voluntary confession. After serving her prison term, she will be subjected to conditional release for 5 years. Additionally, Yasmina must fulfill financial and personal obligations, including paying €75,000 in compensation to Marina's mother and €22,000 to Marina's sisters, Alba, Andrea Lucia, and Alejandra. She is also prohibited from contacting them for 22 years. Regarding Antonio Manuel, who was initially accused of helping to conceal the crime, the prosecutor's office recommended a prison sentence of 15 months. However, due to his cognitive disability, judicial authorities ultimately dropped all charges against him. Marina's family announced plans to appeal the decision, arguing that the punishment was insufficient given the severity of the crime. In public statements, they criticized the lack of support from Spanish legal institutions, particularly since the case was not fully classified as domestic violence. They expressed deep concern about the authorities' stance on this issue, which they deemed highly significant. In their appeal efforts, the prosecution aimed not only to increase Yasmina's sentence but also to establish a precedent for similar cases. Meanwhile, Yasmina's defense announced plans to file an appeal, seeking either a reduction in the charges or a complete reversal of the verdict. In July 2023, the Supreme Court of Andalusia rejected both appeals, upholding the original sentence of 17 years in prison along with the restrictions imposed on Yasmina. The court confirmed that the sentence was appropriate and justified based on the evidence presented during the trial. In press interviews, Teresa, Marina's mother, shared the hardships she and her 4 daughters faced following Marina's tragic death. She also expressed frustration over the authorities' failure to implement adequate protective measures, despite the numerous complaints she had personally filed.
The case of Kathleen Lorek. Kathleen Lorek was born on August 9, 1953, in New Mexico, USA, into a large and loving family. She had 2 sisters, Loretta and Serena, as well as 3 brothers, William, Leo, and Joseph. In the 1970s, her family relocated to California. It was there that Kathleen met Jeffrey Line, and their relationship quickly blossomed. At the age of 23, Kathleen married Jeffrey, and shortly afterward, they welcomed their first child, Mike. Over the following years, they had 2 more children, Eric, born in December 1980, and Marissa, born in August 1983. However, as their family grew, Kathleen and Jeffrey's relationship began to deteriorate. After 20 years of marriage, they divorced in 1997. The divorce was challenging, but Kathleen was granted primary custody of the children. While Jeffrey retained visitation rights and was required to pay child support, Kathleen focused on rebuilding her life. During this difficult time, she regained her zest for life. She became more social, remained in California, and as her children grew up and moved out, she fully embraced her independence. Around this period, Kathleen secured a position as an assistant to the general director at a tech company. Her career is progressing steadily, and she seems to be heading toward a promising future. During her time at work, Kathleen met Johannes Lorek, the son of one of her colleagues and a native of Austria. They quickly bonded and began dating. Despite the challenges posed by Johannes frequently traveling back to Austria, the two maximized their time together. Whether enjoying romantic dinners or taking trips to the mountains, they made efforts to strengthen their relationship. In early 2003, during one of their trips to the Swiss Alps, Johannes proposed to Kathleen. However, there was a significant challenge. Johannes planned to move back to Austria permanently. Kathleen accepted his proposal and appeared ready to join him in Europe. They were married in the United States, but Kathleen still had many ongoing projects to complete before she could reunite with Johannes and begin their life together in Austria. Kathleen worked as an executive assistant to the company director, a role she performed with dedication and reliability. She was highly regarded by management and colleagues alike for her professionalism. The company was located near the Contra Costa Canal Trail, a popular spot in the Concord area where locals often jogged or biked. Kathleen frequently took walks along the trail during her lunch break. She kept a pair of sneakers at work just for these walks, and whether she went alone or with a colleague, it became part of her daily routine. Many of her colleagues also enjoyed using the trail during breaks. During her lunch break, which typically lasted about an hour, Kathleen not only had time to eat and rest but also to speak with her husband, Johannes. They often called each other multiple times a day, eagerly anticipating the moment they could reunite. 2 months after their wedding, during a normal workday, Kathleen left for her usual lunch break. On Tuesday, May 13, 2003, at 12:40 p.m., she decided to take a walk along the nearby trail to get some fresh air and talk to Johannes. Co-workers saw Kathleen leave the office and head toward the canal. Typically, this path would be populated with joggers, casual cyclists, or dog walkers, since it was midday and the area was fairly busy. Strangely, however, on that day, the path seemed unusually quiet. In the distance, Kathleen noticed a few figures moving farther away. As she walked along the road, she passed a few people, but at that time, nothing suspicious. After all, she was on the phone with Johannes, who was an excellent companion for conversation. Kathleen and Johannes were calmly discussing their future plans when suddenly Johannes heard an alarming noise, a scream, followed by a thud, and then the call abruptly disconnected. He immediately tried to call his wife back but was sent to voicemail. Unable to reach Kathleen, he contacted her workplace. By the time he reached her colleagues, they were already concerned because she hadn't returned from her usual walk. Kathleen's prolonged absence was unusual. She maintained a consistent routine, particularly when it came to her lunchtime walks. Known for her reliability, it was entirely out of character for her to leave work without notice. Her co-workers and supervisors were puzzled, while Johannes grew increasingly worried. Efforts to locate her in the office were unsuccessful, prompting them to notify the Concord Police Department around 3 p.m. The police took the matter seriously and immediately began investigating. Within 10 minutes of receiving the call, officers started searching along the route Kathleen was expected to follow. Shortly into their search, they discovered blood on the pavement along with marks resembling bicycle tire tracks. The blood smear extended into nearby bushes. Following the trail, the police found Kathleen's sneaker around 3:30 p.m. Her co-workers identified the bloodied shoe, which lay in a pool of blood. Just a few meters from this spot, in a wooded area, a mutilated body was discovered lying on the ground amidst a horrifying scene. The victim appeared to have been brutally attacked and murdered. The assault was so violent that she could only be identified by her clothing, which was mostly pulled down. Authorities believed the attack was motivated by abuse. Kathleen was still alive at first, though she was in critical condition. She was rushed to the nearest medical center, but medical intervention was unsuccessful. At 4:54 p.m., she was declared dead due to a traumatic brain injury. Her skull had been completely shattered during the attack, leaving her head severely crushed. Kathleen, who was employed by a local company, had been attacked while walking on the trail. Johannes had heard her scream over the phone during the assault. Kathleen suffered severe head trauma caused by a blunt object, and after the initial blow, she was dragged into the nearby bushes. Along the way, she endured further brutal beatings, with fragments of her scalp and hair later found along the trail of blood. The area where the crime took place was concealed from view by a hill, making it easier for the attacker to go unnoticed. But the question remained, who could commit such a barbaric and horrific act against a woman? Police requested backup, and forensic experts meticulously examined the crime scene for evidence. Detectives interviewed Kathleen's colleagues and local residents, while law enforcement appealed to the public through the media, seeking witnesses or crucial information. The city offered a $10,000 reward for tips leading to the criminal's arrest. Early in the investigation, only a few reports surfaced, none of which provided useful information. A thorough search of the path and the bushes where Kathleen had been dragged also failed to uncover any new clues. The murderer appeared experienced in committing violent crimes, leaving no trace behind. An autopsy revealed the extent of the brutality Kathleen had suffered. She was severely beaten over an extended period and was also abused. Detectives confirmed that it was an unprovoked act, a conclusion that was corroborated by Johannes. The attack was spontaneous, leaving Kathleen with no chance to defend herself. She sustained no defensive injuries, as she likely lost consciousness after the first blow to her head. Investigators began exploring possible theories about the killer. One theory suggested that the culprit could have been a maniac acting in a state of extreme emotional disturbance, given the excessive cruelty of the crime. Another theory considered a personal connection between Kathleen and the perpetrator, yet who could harbor such hatred toward a kind and gentle woman like her? Johannes, her husband, was unable to provide any meaningful leads. Although the assault took place while Kathleen was talking to him on the phone, he did not hear any names or clues that could reveal the attacker's identity. It appeared Kathleen was struck immediately, causing her phone to be knocked out of her hand, fall to the ground, and shut off. Within an hour of searching, the forensic scientist discovered what appeared to be the murder weapon, a metal rod, torn from a fence made of thick, concreted steel bars. It seemed likely the attacker had discarded it near the crime scene. A bloodied fragment of the rod lay just a few meters away from Kathleen's body. The investigation revealed that she had been struck multiple times with the rod, causing fatal skull fractures. Even if she had survived, the injuries would have left her permanently paralyzed. Friends and family were unable to suggest anyone who might have had a motive to harm Kathleen. With no clear leads, detectives focused on her immediate social circle. They discovered that she had a calm and non-aggressive personality, consistently avoiding anything unlawful or confrontational. Her life was generally peaceful, except for one tumultuous period, her divorce in 1987 from her first husband, Jeffrey Line. Known to be a particularly bitter process, the divorce raised suspicions about Jeffrey. Detectives speculated that Jeffrey might have harbored lingering resentment toward Kathleen, which could have intensified upon learning of her recent wedding. This potential surge of anger might have led him to act impulsively. However, the investigation stalled, leaving the crime unsolved. When the crime scene was eventually reopened, unease persisted in the area. Local residents avoided the spot, fearing another violent incident, and employees of nearby businesses stopped visiting, concerned about encountering a possible predator. Kathleen's second husband, Johannes, was quickly cleared as a suspect. His alibi was solid, confirmed by a verified mobile phone call that placed him far from the crime scene at the time. Investigators also interviewed Jeffrey, the ex-husband, who also had an ironclad alibi. They explored the possibility that either man could have hired someone to commit the crime. However, this line of inquiry led nowhere and seemed unlikely from the outset. Within hours of contacting the police, both men were removed from the list of suspects. As investigators scrutinized the area surrounding Kathleen's body, they discovered something significant was missing: her phone. If she had been on a call during the attack, where was her phone? Detectives suspected the killer might have taken it. Tracing the phone's signal led them to a residential complex just a 5-minute drive from the forest where the body was found. Police quickly obtained a search warrant for the entire building. During the search, officers encountered Juan Sanchez, a 20-year-old resident, who reluctantly admitted that he had Kathleen's phone. At first, it seemed he might be involved in the crime. However, Juan denied any wrongdoing, explaining that he had found the phone earlier that day while riding his bike. On his way back from the store, he came across a phone abandoned near the blood trail that detectives had discovered earlier. Juan led authorities to the location where he had found it, approximately 50 meters from the trail. The authorities found Juan's account plausible but opted to verify it through DNA testing. Kathleen had been abused, and biological samples collected from her body allowed investigators to create a DNA profile of the attacker. However, the case predated advanced DNA analysis techniques, and the process took significant time. Once the attacker's profile was developed, it was compared to entries in the DNA database, which, at the time, contained only around 6 million samples, a relatively limited number. Unfortunately, no match was found. Juan's DNA did not correspond to the crime scene evidence, leaving the investigation at a dead end. As police struggled to make progress in their investigation, fear and confusion grew in the local community. Residents felt unsafe knowing someone capable of such a brutal attack, a broad daylight assault with a steel rod, was still free. Investigators speculated that someone in Kathleen's social circle might have been infatuated with her, harboring jealousy or anger over her marriage. This theory became the primary focus of the investigation during that period. According to one of Kathleen's colleagues, shortly before she met Johannes, she had a brief relationship with a young German man. A friend stated that Kathleen was supposed to meet him just a few days before the attack. It seemed that she was feeling uncertain, so she wanted to clarify things by explaining that she was married and wanted him to end any hope of pursuing a relationship with her. Though a deeper relationship was clearly impossible, she was willing to meet him once, as he seemed to have good intentions. However, some individuals do not handle rejection well, which can sometimes lead to dangerous behavior. The investigators began looking into this clue, but they could not confirm any meetings or communications between Kathleen and the German man. When Johannes entered her life, this connection was severed entirely. From interviews with people who were in the area on the day of the incident, the detectives uncovered something noteworthy. Shortly before Kathleen was attacked, a suspicious man was seen in the vicinity. According to witnesses, his behavior was odd. One passerby mentioned that he had tried to lure Kathleen into the bushes under the pretense of showing her something, while another person described the man fishing in a nearby pond. These witnesses worked with a sketch artist, resulting in 2 separate portraits based on their descriptions. Although the witnesses had not communicated with each other, the sketches displayed striking similarities, which boosted the police's confidence that they now had a visual of the suspect. The reward for information leading to the capture of the criminal has been increased by $25,000, bringing the total to $35,000. This reward is offered by the company where Kathleen used to work. As expected, this generated a flood of unrelated tips, many of which were ultimately unrelated to the case. A press conference was held, during which Mike, Kathleen's eldest child, made an emotional public appeal asking for help to find his mother's killer. Authorities also released sketches of the suspected perpetrator. Simultaneously, detectives compared the sketches to a database of known criminals with histories of abuse or violence. Based on the psychological profile, they believed the suspect was an experienced offender with a history of violent behavior, likely including incidents involving bloodshed. Their investigation eventually led them to identify John Kaler as a match to the released sketch. Trained dogs were brought in and followed his scent to his home, but the trail ended near a highway just a few kilometers away. 3 days after the attack, on May 16, 2003, the police arrived at John's residence. To their surprise, it wasn't John who answered the door but a frightened and frail woman. She introduced herself as his sister, Elizabeth, and stated that the officers had arrived too late. She explained that on May 14th, after the press circulated images of the suspect following a press conference, John went to the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco and ended his life. Detectives concluded this was no coincidence and believed John had ended his life due to the enormity of committing one of the most senseless and violent crimes in recent history. The police obtained warrants to search John's residence, and the findings confirmed their suspicions. Among the evidence were bloody clothes matching witness descriptions of the man seen on the day of the attack on Kathleen. They also found newspaper clippings about the crime, a behavior often associated with murderers. Additionally, they discovered a cutout likeness of the police sketch, created based on witness accounts, which closely resembled John. John's prior offenses were relatively minor compared to the heinous crime he was now suspected of committing, leaving everyone shocked that he could be responsible for such an atrocity. Authorities believed his mental health struggles may have contributed to his dangerous tendencies. However, John's parents strongly disagreed. His father criticized law enforcement, accusing them of unfairly linking his son's mental health condition to the horrific crime. He saw this as an insult to his son's memory and a way to unjustly defame a man already suffering from an illness. The police required John's DNA to confirm or refute the evidence against him. Witnesses who assisted in creating the composite sketch were shown photographs of John, and all of them identified him as the same suspicious individual seen on the walking path. As the news spread, media outlets and newspapers picked up the story, fueling public speculation. John's father passionately defended his son's innocence, prompting authorities to hold a press conference where they admitted that their suspicions might be unfounded until the DNA results were finalized. This reignited public concern about the potential threat posed by an unidentified criminal. When authorities reviewed John's history, they discovered he had been arrested 4 times for drunk driving over the past decade. Additionally, in 1987, he had threatened to kill a judge's mother, which led the judge to believe there could be no mistake in identifying him as the suspect. However, the DNA test results were shocking. John was not responsible for Kathleen's murder and assault. The revelation profoundly shocked the public, especially after John had faced severe backlash due to the media's portrayal of him as guilty based on suspicion alone. His family demanded an apology, arguing that the damage inflicted on John's reputation ultimately drove him to end his life. The publication of portraits resembling him further contributed to his devastation. John's father advocated for legal reforms to protect the families of suspects when there is insufficient evidence. Tragically, despite their efforts, their family inadvertently fell victim to the fallout from the investigation. Kathleen's loved ones, trying to help solve the case, donated $5,000 to a reward fund for information leading to the perpetrator's capture. This brought the total reward to $40,000, but it did little to advance the investigation. Detectives worked diligently, collecting DNA samples from at least 5 different men, but none provided breakthroughs. Approximately 4 months after the murder, a witness who had previously spoken to investigators returned to the station with new information. He described encountering a suspicious man with a bicycle near the canal shortly before the attack. The man was standing in an unusual location, looking around nervously, and appeared alarmed upon noticing the witness. The two briefly spoke, smoked a cigarette together, and then parted ways. Hoping this encounter might yield evidence, the police asked the witness to identify the location. Remarkably, they discovered the cigarette, but the men had smoked among others in the area. DNA testing on the filter confirmed a match, providing a critical lead in the case. The witness met with the police again and shared detailed information about the suspicious cyclist. While he did not know the man's identity, he learned during their conversation that the individual worked at a telemarketing company in Walnut Creek, located about 15 minutes from the walking trail. Since there was only one telemarketing company in the area, the police visited its offices. With witness-provided sketches and some assumptions, detectives reviewed photographs of all the employees. Colleagues quickly identified one employee, 38-year-old Robert Ward Frazier, who bore an uncanny resemblance to John Kaler, so much so that the two might have been mistaken for brothers. Suspiciously, Robert had stopped coming to work shortly after the murder. Detectives tracked down his last known residence and visited his apartment, but their efforts led to another dead end. Robert's ex-wife disclosed that he had left a few weeks earlier. While she did not know his current location, she provided his toothbrush, which allowed investigators to collect DNA for comparison with evidence from the crime scene. The case stalled once again, pending DNA analysis. Then, unexpectedly, the police received a tip from a sheriff's office in Indiana, where Robert had been arrested for an unrelated offense. He had attempted to return to his hometown but was wanted in another state for violating probation conditions before moving to California. Authorities questioned Robert, who admitted to living near the area where Kathleen was murdered. However, he vehemently denied any involvement in the crime. Originally, Robert denied having any involvement in the case. However, DNA test results confirmed a match to the crime scene evidence. When confronted, he claimed that he had walked along the path while intoxicated, needed to relieve himself, and may have accidentally left DNA traces on Kathleen's body while urinating. However, this explanation did not account for how his bodily fluids ended up inside her. Even when faced with incontrovertible evidence, Robert continued to fabricate lies. The DNA results clearly implicated him, which led to his arrest on charges of abuse and first-degree murder. The severity of the case meant that John faced the possibility of receiving the death penalty or, at the very least, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In May 2006, Robert went to court, showing no emotion and refusing to admit to his crimes. His defense team scrambled to find ways to lessen his sentence, while the prosecution relied on the uncompromising evidence of the case. Simply recounting the horrifying details, a crime driven by cruel lust, was enough to shock the jury. The trial lasted an entire month, despite the strength of the prosecution's arguments. Ultimately, Robert Ward Frazier was found guilty on all charges. In a final effort to reduce the sentence, the defense attorneys emphasized his troubled early years. They explained that he grew up with parents who had substance abuse problems, which resulted in significant hardships. Robert endured immense psychological pressure as well as abuse, experiences that the lawyers claimed had shaped him into the person he had become. However, the prosecutor countered that a traumatic childhood does not justify committing violent acts. The jury ultimately concluded that Robert Ward Frazier deserved the death penalty. Upon hearing the verdict, he displayed emotion for the first time during the trial, accusing everyone of being biased against him. He is currently on death row, awaiting the execution of his sentence, all while continuing to proclaim his innocence.
The case of Clelia Medina. Early in the morning on Sunday, February 17, 2008, a man was walking with his dog when he suddenly noticed that the dog was attracted to something strange on the ground. Looking closely, he realized it was a series of drops forming a path. He began to follow them, moving parallel to the canal, not far from Lambersart, France. The drops continued, leading him to the very shore where he noticed a body half submerged in the water. It was swollen and very pale. The man immediately reported it to the police. In the name of law enforcement, forensic experts began to carefully examine the area and the body itself. However, there was nothing that could help identify the female victim. It was not possible to find a handbag that might have contained documents, a mobile phone, or bank cards. The body was taken for an autopsy, and the police continued to investigate the area around the canal for any clues about the identity of the victim. While the medical examiner was working in his office, detectives checked the databases of missing persons to find anything that could help identify the body. In this area, no recent disappearances had been recorded. When it became obvious that the unidentified victim could not be recognized, forensic scientists began searching the canal bank for clues indicating the identity of the deceased or the perpetrator. In the relatively small area where the body was found, cigarette butts and anything that could contain human DNA were collected. To ensure that nothing was missed, a team of divers was called in to check the bottom of the canal. This decision turned out to be correct. One diver managed to retrieve a car jack from the bottom, found just a meter away from the body. The jack, belonging to a standard set for a wing car, had a serial number indicating it was used in a vehicle produced in 1997. It had been in the water for quite a long time, so traces from its surface could have washed away. However, during the examination, human bloodstains were found. They continued to collect data. Initially, it was believed that the victim had been strangled, as characteristic marks remained on her neck. However, the forensic expert concluded that the cause of death was multiple strong blows to the head with a blunt object. The location and shape of the marks resembled those made by a car jack. There were suggestions that the girl could have died in a road accident, but the longer they attempted to prove this, the less plausible the theory seemed. It was soon decided to abandon this idea. It clearly indicated a methodical beating after which the body was simply thrown into the water. A toxicological examination showed that the victim was either intoxicated from alcohol or under the influence of prohibited substances. The deceased was fully dressed, and no signs of abuse were found. At the same time, there were no marks on her hands that would indicate she had fought for her life. The attack had likely come as a surprise to her, and she was unable to defend herself. According to the forensic expert, she died around 5 a.m. The police had only one clue that could help solve the mystery of her identity: a small stamp on her palm that had miraculously not washed away in the water. Such stamps are given to club visitors at the entrance, allowing security to recognize them without the need to check passes or flyers. Typically, these stamps are unique to each establishment and are not replicated. It was quickly discovered that the victim had visited the Buccaneer Club located nearby shortly before her death. Detectives arrived at the club, immediately spoke with the administration and employees, providing them with a description of the deceased. Two young men recognized the girl because she occasionally attended the disco, but no one knew her name. The detectives managed to access the recordings from the CCTV cameras. Thanks to that, the victim was identified. She had arrived at the club the day before she was found in the canal, apparently leaving Buccaneer around 3 a.m. and being killed by 5 a.m. What happened to her between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. remained unknown. The police spoke to regular patrons and staff in the hope that someone recognized her from the CCTV footage, but no valuable clues about her identity emerged. So far, no missing persons reports had been filed. The police were left with only one option to identify the deceased: to hold a press conference and appeal to the public through the media. Detectives provided a detailed description of the victim and showed footage from the club's CCTV cameras. Within a few hours, a woman admitting that she was the mother of 18-year-old Clelia Medina. She reported that her daughter had gone to the club about a day before these events and had not returned or been in touch. She immediately became concerned. Relatives and friends had no idea where Clelia might have spent the night. No one had seen Clelia after visiting the club, which caused anxiety and prompted her mother to search for her. Approximately 36 hours had passed when she managed to contact the local police station in Lille, but received the standard excuse that law enforcement officers did not want to waste time looking for a girl who had simply gone on a spree after the club and was likely spending time with friends or a boyfriend. When she saw a news program about the police announcing the discovery of a body and the terrible circumstances surrounding the tragedy, she initially tried to dismiss any bad thoughts about it possibly being her daughter. However, the worry persisted. She literally felt that something bad had happened to her daughter and feared that it was Clelia's body that had been found in the canal. She acted extremely worried and was very agitated, providing somewhat confused information due to her emotional state. Therefore, the police decided to verify the information with Clelia's cousin, who had been with Clelia that evening. The young man confirmed some of the details provided by Clelia's mother. He helped to clarify valuable information such as the clothing and piercing locations that Clelia had. The victim's identity was almost completely matched. Clelia's mother was notified of the coincidence and was invited to identify the body. All doubts were finally dispelled. The mother was shocked by her daughter's tragic death, and she immediately began to cry. She struggled to understand who could have done this, as her daughter was an ordinary girl who did not associate with problematic people. According to her cousin, they had planned to go to Buccaneer Club together, the seal of which was found on her hand. He described his relationship with Clelia as very friendly and warm. They communicated well, supported each other. That evening, everyone was in good spirits. From the very beginning, Clelia's mother had been worried about her daughter attending the party. She felt strongly that Clelia should not go. To calm her mother, Clelia explained that they would not be walking home alone and that everything would be fine. Despite the fact that her cousin took her to the club, he did not intend to stay there long. Clelia managed to reassure her mother by telling her that her ex-boyfriend, 19-year-old Julian Saley, was supposed to drive her home. The whole family knew him well and trusted him. Julian Saley and Clelia had been in a relationship for about a year, which had ended a couple of months before Clelia's death. As Clelia's mother noted, even after the breakup, they continued to communicate as friends. Law enforcement officers decided to check the records of telephone conversations, which verified that Clelia had indeed called her ex-boyfriend when she left the club. However, the police did not have time to visit his home, as he came to the station on his own initiative to talk to the investigators. Julian was eager to help because he was worried about what had happened. In his statement, he emphasized that Clelia had contacted him after he left the cinema. He promptly went to the club, where he picked her up in his car in the parking lot. They spent some time together at his house, but at about 4:30 in the morning, Clelia headed home. Julian believed that she could have been attacked during this time. The police immediately questioned why he did not drive Clelia home at such a late hour. He explained that it was only a short walk left to get home, as the houses were located close together. It was already getting light, he was very tired and drunk, so cannot take her home. Clelia herself did not want to impose on anyone and was not afraid for her safety. Unfortunately, Julian simply went to bed and turned off his mobile phone to avoid being disturbed. Until he woke up, he could not reach Clelia but did not think much of it, believing that she could be spending time with someone new, as there was no romantic relationship between them anymore. However, upon learning about the tragedy in the Medina family, Julian felt compelled to help with the investigation, so provided his testimony. The detectives, however, immediately suspected that he might not just want to help. Such behavior is often seen in murderers attempting to divert suspicion from themselves. Thus, they decided not to let him leave too quickly, hoping he would either incriminate himself or provide genuine assistance in the investigation. Suspicion grew stronger as Julian reacted very calmly to the details of the crime. He did not show any emotions when looking at the disfigured image, and he appeared neither upset nor shocked. His lack of reaction to the details of his ex-girlfriend's death, combined with the fact that he was the last person to see her, made him a person of interest to the detectives. It is known that in such cases, exes are often involved, who kill out of jealousy, resentment, or revenge. To establish or refute this, the investigators asked Julian to show them his car. The detective specifically did not mention the jack that had been found in the canal. He agreed to this request without hesitation. According to his confession, he arrived at the police station in the same car in which he had driven Clelia from the club to his home. The policeman went out into the street with him, and in the parking lot, they found a notch indicating the year of manufacture of the car matched the jack. As soon as the door was opened, they felt a very strong smell of cleaning products. The interior was excessively clean for a young guy. It seemed that a very thorough cleaning had been carried out recently. Nevertheless, Julian immediately justified himself by saying that he had bought a new car only 10 days prior, and the previous owner had cleaned it well before selling it. The police were most interested in the possibility of blood being present. Perhaps Julian could have attacked Clelia in his car or transported the body after the attack. When the mat in the trunk was lifted, they found several suspicious dark red drops that were collected for further analysis. However, none of these stains belonged to Clelia. Nevertheless, Julian continued to be considered the main suspect. It was believed that this was an attack based on passion, so the killer must have known the victim well. Furthermore, the make of the car matched the jack was found at the bottom of the canal. Julian seemed ideal as a suspect based on all the criteria. After, they found one valuable clue, a blood stain on one of Julian's sneakers. After examination, it was possible to prove that the blood belonged to Clelia. but it was not possible to date it with precision. Julian insisted that the stain appeared by chance when Clelia had a nosebleed about a month before the tragedy. However, his words could not be confirmed or refuted, so this evidence turned out to be indirect. Even Clelia's family was sure that Julian could not have done this. He had always been a very nice guy. Clelia's mother believed wholeheartedly that he was not capable of murder. She commented that Clelia was almost crazy about Julian based on his appearance. He was very kind, loving, and gave Clelia many gifts. However, their relationship was not entirely smooth. They often argued. Julian as an accomplished young man for his age. He grew up in a strict but loving family in Lille, France. From an early age, he was interested in sports, especially football, which he played with his father. He was not prone to violence and avoided fights, despite being in perfect shape. However, he was forced to drop out of school because of football, wanting to build a sports career, and simply chose training over textbooks. His parents supported their son's decision, especially since he was mature enough for his age. At the same time, they described him as charming but very jealous. They mentioned that he could become upset over a random photo of a stranger on the internet that Clelia was looking at. As their relationship progressed, Julian became more and more jealous. Due to such tumultuous dynamics, they eventually broke up. Despite the tensions, they continued to maintain friendly relations, and everything seemed normal. Except for the circumstantial evidence against Julian, there was no concrete proof. He was released pending further investigation. Then, Julian was arrested and charged with Clelia's murder. He spent about a year in prison, but his lawyer managed to get him released before his trial. Julian repeatedly appealed, claiming there was insufficient evidence to convict him, and was released on bail. However, this lasted until 2011, when his formal trial began. A rather controversial trial lay ahead. From the very beginning, the situation was tense, partly because Clelia's family had changed their opinion about Julian over the lengthy investigation period. They became convinced, based on several dubious facts, that the deceased's ex-boyfriend was indeed a criminal. Clelia's family now demanded punishment for the supposed killer. At this stage, it was necessary to assess the mental health of the suspect. In June 2008, Julian was visited by an expert psychiatrist who noted no deviations. Julian willingly made contact and described in detail the events related to Clelia. He admitted that there had indeed been several conflicts which ended in slaps to the face. Although he did not think this was normal, he justified himself, citing jealousy regarding Clelia and claiming that she had stolen from him multiple times. After the examination, the specialist concluded that Julian was completely in his right mind and capable of appearing in court. Tension was literally in the air. The defense team escalated the situation to the point where a fight broke out right in the courtroom. Several people were slightly injured, so the trial was postponed because of this unpleasant incident and the subsequent bureaucratic red tape. Everything was delayed for another year until 2012. From February 2009 until the start of the trial in June 2012, Julian lived with his paternal aunts near Paris. She immediately noticed how angry he was. At first, they thought it was connected to the slander against him. However, his discontent grew as the trial approached. Meanwhile, the Medina family accused Julian's lawyer of unnecessarily dragging out the proceedings, which only heightened tensions. The first witnesses began to speak at the meetings. There was a mutual friend of Clelia and Julian who recalled that all three of them had once been driving in a car together after their romantic relationship had ended. Julian had even started dating a new girl, who happened to be one of Clelia's close friends. This situation made she very upset and jealous. Despite their breakup, a conflict ensued between them, which even escalated to physical confrontation. They exchanged blows. At one point, Clelia even attempted to jump out of the moving car, but Julian managed to pull her back inside. By the time the car reached her friend's house, Clelia finally exited and continued yelling at Julian from the street. He tried to calm her down, but she simply waved her hand dismissively and left the scene. This friend was convinced this was not an isolated incident, as outbursts of jealousy and aggression were repeated throughout their relationship. In addition to this event, Clelia's parents recalled several instances during family vacations with Julian where he lost control. They once caught him walking around the apartment with a weapon. However, he had managed to convince Clelia's relatives that it was just a failed joke. They now understood the situation was much more serious. From the very beginning, Clelia had been in great danger. Another friend of Julian recounted an incident where, in a fit of rage, he began to choke one of his girlfriends. The once pleasant, sociable, and good-natured Julian was now portrayed as a monster capable of losing control at any moment. So, the change in the Medina family's attitude toward him did not seem strange. Julian had lied about the time. He told the police that Clelia left his house at 4:30 a.m. Detectives managed to track their mobile phones and prove that they were still together at 5 a.m., which is when Clelia was believed to have died. Subsequently, Clelia's phone unexpectedly turned off at 5:10 a.m. Previously, during an interrogation, Julian said that attempted to contact Clelia again but could not get a response. Detectives believed the call to his ex-girlfriend was made intentionally to create an alibi. Shortly thereafter, Julian's phone also turned off for several hours. Investigators suspected he deliberately turned off his devices to avoid being tracked. Despite all the circumstantial evidence against him, Julian continued to insist on his innocence. His lawyer argued that none of this evidence proved his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Throughout the investigation, detectives tried to extract a confession from Julian, but he steadfastly maintained his innocence. The pressure from authorities led him to feel embittered. He claimed that the persecution caused him to face difficulties in real life and to suffer from insults, unfounded accusations. Phone records revealed something intriguing. Julian's new girlfriend also tried to contact Clelia shortly before the murder. At first, she did not disclose any details as to why she tried to contact Clelia at all. However, in 2011, the girl spoke to detectives and made a rather dubious statement. According to her, she felt guilty that Clelia was dead. The reason for her fears stemmed from the fact that, as a close friend of Clelia, she was dating Julian. This clearly caused great discontent for his ex-girlfriend, who took every opportunity to contact him. On that fateful night, Julian's new girlfriend decided to act on her feelings. She did not like Clelia as such attention directed at the guy. She believed that this was the impetus for another conflict between the exes, which ended tragically. When the police received this statement, they were puzzled and decided to explore this new details. The application ended up at the station, and detectives tried to find out if it was possible that she was an accomplice. They insisted that Julian's new girlfriend may have unintentionally provoked the attack but did not pursue such a goal intentionally. According to her, she had been afraid to admit it because she feared her boyfriend's reaction. The neck of the deceased showed clear signs of strangulation, as if her throat had been squeezed with bare hands. Apparently, the victim could not have been killed in this way, so the criminal used a metal jack from the car. Although it was inconvenient, it quickly became the instrument that ended the innocent girl's life. The killer inflicted a large number of blows to her head and face, which proved fatal. The degree of cruelty was astounding. He broke her facial bones. The prosecutor addressed the jury, stating that leaving such a dangerous person at large was a crime. Despite the circumstantial nature of the evidence, the prosecution managed to prove the defendant's guilt. The prosecution's witnesses appeared scared as they recounted their experiences with the real Julian. The jury found Julian salely guilty of premeditated murder. As he left the courtroom, he turned to the victim's family and said something that sounded like a threat. From the very moment Julian found himself behind bars, he began writing endless appeals to challenge the sentence, insisting that he was a victim of bias and incompetence. Probably feeling his helplessness and unbearable situation, he even insulted one of the judges in writing, subsequently refusing to retract his comments, insisting he was a victim of governmental arbitrariness. However, all his requests were rejected. While in prison, he was involved in another incident related to his inability to control his aggression. Using a homemade sharpener, he threatened to kill one of the prison guards, whom he took hostage for several minutes. Julian was eventually overpowered and neutralized. Now, he remains behind bars. The case of Yu Young Chol. Yu Young-chul was born on April 18, 1970, into a poor family in Gochang County, South Korea. He had a challenging childhood, as he was bullied at school due to his family's low social status. This early experience of poverty is believed to have fueled his resentment toward wealthier individuals, as some of his future victims were affluent people. Yu and his siblings were abandoned by their mother at a young age. One day, their mother left them at their grandmother's house and never returned. The children were left to live in severe poverty with their elderly, ailing grandmother. Eventually, their father took them in and moved them to live with him and their new stepmother. However, the situation did not improve, as their stepmother treated them cruelly. Tragedy struck again in 1985 when Yu's father died in a traffic accident. Determined to change his life, Yu resolved to work hard and find success to escape poverty. He enrolled in an art school, but his time there was difficult. He was rejected and ostracized by his fellow students, who regarded him as mediocre. In 1988, he decided to attend a technical school to earn any available qualifications. However, instead of focusing on his studies, Yu turned to a life of crime in an attempt to make money quickly. Unfortunately for him, his criminal endeavors were largely unsuccessful. At the age of 18, Yu was arrested for stealing from a wealthy neighbor. He was sent to a juvenile detention center, but the consequences didn't end there. Since he could no longer attend his technical school classes, he was expelled, marking the beginning of a downward spiral. Yu didn't stop stealing. His thefts escalated to more valuable items, including cash and eventually cars. In 1991, he was arrested again for stealing from his landlord. This time, he was sentenced to 10 months in jail, giving him time to reflect on his actions. Despite his criminal record, his girlfriend, who worked as a masseuse, agreed to marry him, and they had a son together. However, instead of focusing on family life, Yu returned to stealing. He was caught stealing a car and sentenced to another 8 months in jail. Around the same time, Yu was diagnosed with epilepsy, leading to a brief stay in a medical facility before returning to his normal life. Interestingly, this epilepsy diagnosis would later become something he used to his advantage. Yu was no stranger to breaking the law for personal gain and had a history of similar crimes, which he regarded as only harming insurance companies. However, over time, he escalated from minor thefts to more serious offenses, becoming increasingly corrupt and unhinged. Yu served a 2-year prison sentence for illegally selling adult photos. Upon his release, he resumed stealing, eventually landing back in prison for another 3 years. Meanwhile, Yu's wife silently shouldered the responsibility of raising their son while he repeatedly committed theft and faced arrests. Her patience finally ran out in the year 2000 when he was accused of abusing a young girl and was subsequently sentenced to 3.5 years in prison. This prompted her to file for divorce. During the investigation and while Yu was in custody, she reported his cruel behavior towards her and his struggles with alcohol abuse. After his release in 2003, Yu embarked on a path of depravity and crime that would horrify the world and plunge the city into fear for years. During his time in prison, he became fascinated with Jong Do-yeon, a murderer who killed 9 people between 1999 and 2000, primarily targeting wealthy individuals to commit theft driven by greed for accumulating wealth. You seem to identify with Jong, sharing a deep resentment toward the rich, whom he blamed for his own misfortunes. Simultaneously, Yu developed profound animosity towards women following his divorce. This resentment, combined with his admiration for Jong, fueled his hatred and destructive thoughts. He later expressed beliefs that women should not be escorts and that wealthy people should be held accountable for their privilege. After moving into his mother's house following his release, these twisted ideologies drove him further down the path toward the horrific crimes that would eventually earn him the title of the Cloaked Killer. Yu was granted permission to see his son, though these visits could have taken a much darker turn. Yu had devised a plan to exact revenge on his ex-wife in the most brutal way possible, intending to kill both her and their son. However, he ultimately admitted that he couldn't bring himself to follow through with it, leaving his wife and child unharmed. Instead, he shifted his focus to a new target, wealthy individuals. But before pursuing this goal, Yu decided he needed to practice killing. and he already had a plan for how to do so. You crafted his own weapon by modifying a large hammer, shortening its handle for convenience. Armed with this weapon, along with a knife and gloves, he prepared for what he called his revenge. To test his weapon, you began luring stray dogs into isolated areas of the woods and brutally attacking them. It's worth noting that many serial killers exhibit similar behaviors in their early years. By September 2003, Yu was just an ordinary man who had recently been released from prison and was savoring his newfound freedom. However, this freedom was short-lived. Within 2 weeks, he began executing his sinister plan, targeting a wealthy neighborhood. His first victim was identified quickly. Professor Lee Deok-soo, a wealthy man in his 70s, lived with his wife, Lee Eun-ok, in one of the elegant houses in the neighborhood. At 10 a.m., Yu forcefully entered their home, armed with his homemade hammer. He first struck Deok-soo in the neck before shifting his focus to Eun-ok, brutally striking her with the hammer until he was certain she was dead. Finally, he brought Deok-soo's life to an end. After committing the crime, Yu calmly cleaned the rooms, scrubbed away the blood, and walked out. However, he soon realized he had left his knife behind and returned to retrieve it. This time, when he broke into the house more aggressively and caused damage, he deliberately staged the scene to resemble a botched robbery in an attempt to mislead investigators. This plan ultimately backfired. When the police inspected the crime scene, they discovered footprints that later proved to be a significant clue. On October 9th, in another upscale neighborhood of Seoul, Yu, carrying the same weapons, broke into a wealthy family's home around noon. Inside, he encountered an 85-year-old woman named Kang Eun-sun and fatally stabbed her with a knife. Her screams caused her daughter-in-law, Lee Suk-jin, to rush into the room. Yu angrily demands that Suk-jin bow her head in defeat, but she firmly refuses and even threatens him in front of her husband and sons. Enraged, Yu reacted violently and killed her swiftly. Eun-sun's disabled nephew, Go Jin-soo, became Yu's next victim. Yu forced him to kneel and brutally beat him with a hammer, killing him mercilessly. This case revealed just how severely Yu's psychopathy had escalated. Evidence from this crime scene and previous ones caught the attention of the police, providing them with a crucial lead. Investigators launched a search through their database to identify the perpetrator. Meanwhile, Yu continued his violent spree, seemingly emboldened by his actions. His next target was a 60-year-old woman named Ju Jun-hee, who lived alone. Yu broke into her house and, upon encountering her, dragged her into the bathroom, where he savagely beat her nearly to death. Her son later discovered her barely alive, but she succumbed to her injuries despite paramedics' best efforts, dying half an hour after being found. Media outlets began reporting on strange deaths in the area, noting their geographic proximity and raising questions about whether the crimes were connected. Evidence from various crime scenes indicated similarities between the killings, making the connection increasingly apparent. Public fear grew, yet police initially denied any links between the murders. It would be several weeks before Yu's dark urges drove him to kill again. On November 4th, 2003, he broke into a home in a wealthy neighborhood located in Jeonnam-gu province. Inside, he confronted the housekeeper with a knife, threatening her to comply with his demands. Under duress, she led him to the owner's bedroom, where the 87-year-old homeowner, Kim Jong-suk, and a 1-year-old child, presumably her grandson, were present. But this time, Yu encountered a situation he had never faced before. As Yu rushed at Jong-suk with a hammer, the housekeeper grabbed the baby and attempted to escape through the door. Instead of attacking the child, Yu took him from her, carried him to another room, and left him there unharmed. Returning to the bedroom, he discovered the homeowner was dead and redirected his violence toward the housekeeper, who tragically lost her life in the attack. However, this time, Yu made a critical mistake. To cover his tracks, he resorted to his usual method of smashing property to make the scene appear like a failed robbery. However, he realized he had left blood traces on the safe door after cutting his finger while attempting to open it, a crucial lead for the police. If Yu's decision to spare the baby initially seemed to hint at a shred of humanity, his chilling actions afterward destroyed any such impression, leaving a trail of horror and disgust. You attempted to destroy evidence by setting the house on fire with the child still inside, then watched the flames consume parts of the home from a safe distance. Despite the intense fire that destroyed the bodies and the main bedroom, most of the house remained intact. Investigators were able to recover surviving CCTV footage, which offered them a glimpse of South Korea's new serial killer. The footage showed a man wearing a sweater he had taken from the house, likely to cover the bloodstains on his clothes. Although only visible from behind, the image provided a valuable lead for investigators. Police also discovered another set of shoe prints at the crime scene, further linking this murder to previous ones. Still, Yu continued his spree. While following his established pattern, he decided to deviate and seek change, which led him to his next victim. Yu, now posing as a police officer by obtaining a uniform, began extorting money from women working in escort services or the red light district. He excelled at this illegal activity, earning enough money to rent an apartment and maintain his reckless lifestyle. During this time, Yu started dating a woman from the escort services. His disdain for women deepened when she refused his proposal to live together after discovering his troubled past, including his previous marriage. This rejection marked a turning point for Yu, sparking his desire for revenge. On March 16, 2004, Yu returned to the streets with sinister intentions. Dressed as a police officer, he pretended to arrest a girl and took her to his apartment. This time, unlike his previous victims, he killed her by strangulation, fully revealing his deeply sadistic nature. Due to the inability to safely move the body out of the third floor, Yu decided to put it in a grocery bag and bury it near Sogang University. To ensure he wouldn't reuse the burial site, he marked the spot with a bottle cap. His next victim deviated from his usual pattern. After buying fake Viagra from a street vendor on Jae-sun but it doesn't work, Yu once again disguises himself as a police officer and arrests Jae-sun for selling illegal pharmaceuticals. Driving Jae-sun's personal van, he went to a secluded area and launched a brutal attack. He wounded Jae-sun in the head and neck, but Jae-sun fought back, injuring him in the process. Infuriated by the resistance, Yu struck back with a hammer, landing over 20 brutal blows to Jae-sun's head. Yu's blood was discovered in Jae-sun's van, forcing him to eliminate the evidence. He drove the van to a nearby parking lot under cover of night and set it on fire, destroying both the vehicle and the body inside. Following this event, Yu focused on targeting women working in escort services within the red light district. This marked the beginning of a brief but horrifying series of murders, resulting in the deaths of many people and leaving deep scars on the families affected by his violent actions. Yu changed his approach by luring women to his apartment, where he assaulted them individually before burying their bodies in various locations. To avoid burying in the same place, he marked each place with a bottle cap. He repeated this method with 9 victims. However, his lack of foresight ultimately led to his downfall. Suspicion arose when a massage parlor owner began noticing a pattern of unexplained disappearances. Several of the missing women worked for establishments owned by the same man. Strangely enough, family or friends are often unaware of these disappearances because many of these girls live independently, which makes them more likely to become targets of attacks. One day, the massage shop owner received a request from a man who wanted to use the services of a girl working at the shop. Further investigation revealed that the phone number belonged to one of the earlier missing victims. Alarmed, the owner contacted the police and worked with them to craft a plan aimed at capturing the perpetrator, suspecting that the women were being abducted and possibly trafficked. When the investigators sent an undercover employee to collaborate on the plan, the police prepared to apprehend the suspect, seemingly close to detaining Yu. However, Yu abruptly canceled the meeting and called the girl back. The reason? The girl's height played a key role. Many of Yu's victims had been forced into submissive positions, often kneeling, which indicated his preference for control. His targets were typically elderly individuals, vulnerable women, or escort service workers, chosen because they were easier to overpower. Encountering a taller girl made Yu feel less dominant, which prompted him to call off the meeting at the last minute. The police didn't give up. Shortly afterward, they identified the perfect undercover officer, and Yu took the bait. Before he could act, he was surrounded by police officers. During his arrest, Yu was seen desperately chewing something, later discovered to be business cards belonging to several women. During interrogation, he provided shocking information far beyond the expectations of the police. Yu was transferred to the Seoul Police Department, where investigators questioned him thoroughly about his activities. Although he denied any involvement in abducting or trafficking women, Yu ultimately confessed to multiple murders in affluent neighborhoods. He claimed to have killed more than 20 people, beginning with the Gangnam-gu murders and concluding with the murder of an escort worker just days before his arrest. Despite his confession, the police were skeptical and hesitant to believe his claims immediately, suspecting him of exaggerating to shock them. Whether Yu had fully planned his next move is unclear, but he exploited his epilepsy to stage a fake seizure. Remarkably, the officers believed him, removed his handcuffs, and left the door open, assuming he was too weak to pose any threat. This lapse in judgment allowed him to escape to his apartment, where he began destroying evidence. Within 12 hours, the police located Yu again and detained him, this time, ensuring there was no opportunity for him to flee. During interrogations, Yu repeatedly changed his story. He eventually agreed to guide the police to the burial sites of his victims. During these crime scene investigations, he earned the nickname the Cloaked Killer because the police had to photograph the remains while Yu was draped in a yellow cloak, his face concealed behind a mask. The police department faced significant criticism for its handling of the case. Yu might never have been caught if not for the intervention of local massage parlor owners. He had openly stated that he intended to continue his acts of revenge until someone stopped him. During the trial, Yu attempted to attack the judge and then attempted to end his life while in custody, causing unnecessary delays in the trial process. Upon returning to court, he attempted to assault a spectator and showed no remorse toward the families of his victims. Eventually, Yu Young-chul was found guilty and received the maximum sentence. He is now on death row. Although South Korea has not carried out the death penalty since 1997, his appalling crimes and utter disregard for human life have sparked outrage across the nation. Even if the death penalty is not enforced, the public finds solace in knowing that Yu will spend the rest of his life behind bars. The case of Bill Mowbray. Bill Mowbray lived in Brownsville, Texas, USA, in 1987. He was a decent and loving man who was married to Susie. This was his second marriage. From his first marriage, Bill had a daughter named Christine, who lived with her mother. When Susie met Bill, she was also divorced and had brought her 2 children to live with them. Over the past 9 years, they have built a happy family together. They were only 4 years apart in age and shared many things in common. Despite Susie's eccentric personality, Bill thought of her as the ideal wife. Bill was dedicated not only to his family but also to his career. After attending college, he began working in car sales and eventually transformed into a prominent businessman. By 1987, he had successfully managed Mal Motors, a Cadillac dealership in Brownsville, for 13 years. Susie actively supported his work, often visiting the dealership and even appearing in commercials broadcast across the city. Their success brought them considerable wealth, making them local celebrities regularly seen on TV. The family enjoyed traveling and owned a large mansion in Brownsville, 2 beachfront villas, and several luxury cars. On the surface, their life appeared enviable, but in reality, it was far less glamorous. In recent years, Bill's business had struggled, with the dealership stagnating and showing no signs of growth. Bill realized he was sinking deeper into debt because his expenses far exceeded his income. Despite facing financial difficulties, they upheld an image of wealth and continued to spend lavishly. As their money problems worsened, it became evident they were facing a serious financial crisis. By 1987, the situation had also severely impacted Bill's mental health. He began suffering from depression and often voiced that ending his own life might be the only way to escape their predicament. For Susie, this was an extremely difficult time. Her husband had never spoken or behaved this way before, and she feared he might do something drastic. His relatives were equally concerned for his well-being. They arranged consultations with a psychotherapist in the hopes of helping him, but their efforts yielded little progress. Bill remained firm in his belief that their family urgently needed money, otherwise, the business would collapse, leaving them on the verge of poverty. A solution to their financial struggles seemed nowhere in sight. Facing the threat of bankruptcy, Susie and Bill ultimately believed their best hope lay in securing a new loan from the bank. On September 15, 1987, Susie, 39, and Bill, 43, called to wish Susie's son a happy 16th birthday. At the time, her son and daughter were visiting their father. The conversation was warm and enjoyable, and everything seemed normal. Later that evening, Susie and Bill watched a TV show together before heading to bed. In the early hours of the morning, around 2:15 a.m., Susie woke up to the terrifying scene of her husband holding a weapon pointed at his own head. Before she could react, he pulled the trigger, using his right hand while lying on his side. Shocked and terrified, Susie called out to him, but he didn't respond. Blood rapidly soaked the bed, and with mounting horror, she realized the gravity of his injury. Panicked, she rushed to the home phone to seek help but accidentally dialed the number of her work partner, Bill Luke Roy, instead of emergency services. Susie told Luke what had happened and confessed she didn't know what to do. Luke immediately urged her to call 911. She followed the advice and called the emergency services. However, she had already lost precious minutes, which forced the ambulance to set off immediately. When the ambulance crew arrived at the scene, they found Susie outside the house, standing calmly with a cigarette in one hand and a drink in the other. Showing no signs of distress, she led the paramedics inside and gestured toward the bedroom without entering it. Inside, Bill was lying on the bed, still alive but in critical condition. He was rushed to the hospital, where he later passed away. The cause of death was clear, a weapon injury to the head. Beside him lay a weapon in a pool of blood. Initially, investigators suspected that he had harmed himself, but they decided to carry out a more thorough investigation before reaching any conclusions. Forensic experts began analyzing the scene. The unusually large volume of blood warranted a detailed investigation. Blood spatters were found on much of the furniture, on the wall near the bed, and even on the ceiling fan. Fortunately, a blood spatter expert was brought in to assist. The expert confirmed that Bill had died from a single wound to the head. The only fingerprints found on the weapon during testing were Bill's. Susie has consistently maintained her perspective on the story since the beginning, asserting that Bill suffered from prolonged depression, had a tendency to harm himself, and had expressed these thoughts to multiple people on several occasions. Some of her statements were corroborated by her relatives and friends, as well as Bill's. Bill, a businessman, had been facing mounting challenges in managing his dealership, which seemed to have worsened his mental health. However, Susie's behavior raised significant doubts. She does not seem to be a grieving widow. Instead, she discusses her husband's death calmly, as though it were merely a trivial matter. Still, this wasn't the primary reason investigators began to scrutinize her further. The most shocking detail emerged in the 12 hours following Bill's death. During this time, Jim, Bill's brother, arrived at Bill's residence intending to speak with Susie, offer her support, and try to piece together what had happened by observing the scene. To his surprise, when Jim went upstairs, he heard music and the laughter of women. When he knocked, Susie came out casually and explained that she was hosting a party with friends. Jim found her behavior to be deeply inappropriate and upsetting. Later, Jim became one of Susie's most vocal critics as she desperately tried to prove her innocence. It was discovered that the women attending the gathering had removed all the furniture and carpeting from the bedroom. Not only were they listening to music and socializing, but the most alarming revelation was that they had repainted the bedroom a different color. Police viewed these actions as obvious attempts to interfere with evidence. Despite these suspicious actions, the blood expert successfully reconstructed the sequence of the incident. It is now clear that the case had nothing to do with Bill's self-harm. Detectives became convinced that Susie was the one who had pulled the trigger. Based on evidence collected on the first day, there appeared to be little doubt remaining. The focus then shifted to the remaining pieces of furniture and the nightgown Susie had been wearing. After thorough analysis, the expert concluded that Bill had been murdered by his wife, who had attacked him in the head while he was asleep. Susie was shocked when accused and immediately sought legal help by hiring a lawyer. The financial difficulties in their family's marriage have been confirmed by multiple sources. Susie said that Bill's unsuccessful attempt to obtain a bank loan led him to harm himself. Bill's family was aware of his dire financial situation, but not everyone believed that Susie was completely innocent. Detectives interviewed a loan officer at the bank who had interacted with Bill. The officer recounted how Bill had visited the bank in a deeply distraught state, even breaking down in tears. Bill reportedly stated that, without approval for a $200,000 loan, he would die. Unfortunately, Bill's financial situation was bleak, and his loan application was rejected. The loan officer had no choice but to turn him down. Numerous witnesses attested to Bill's desperation and emotional turmoil. Despite this evidence of Bill's deteriorating mental health, suspicions about Susie remained strong. Her behavior following her husband's death was widely perceived as celebratory rather than mournful. This interpretation led to widespread public condemnation and further distrust of her character. However, her lawyer firmly maintained her innocence. Bill Mowbray, a businessman, applied for a bank loan to keep his business running and pay off existing debts. However, the bank's refusal devastated him. That evening, he returned home deeply distressed and barely interacted with anyone. Susie did her best to console him, but her efforts did little to ease his despair. In the final days of his life, Bill fell into a severe depression as he desperately searched for a solution to his financial crisis. Later, Susie shared that after this incident, Bill frequently spoke about ending his life. She tried to support him by accompanying him to a psychotherapist. The lawyer worked to find evidence that substantiated Susie's claims, and succeeded. Several of Bill's longtime friends revealed that, approximately a decade before the tragedy, Bill had attempted to end his life. This had occurred in the 1970s, before Susie and Bill married, which explained why Susie had never mentioned it. After meeting Susie, his life seemed to improve, and those close to him believed that his past struggles had been overcome. This information further reinforces the narrative that Bill has a history of self-harm. The defense attorney believed this evidence would strongly support Susie if the case went to trial. He dismissed the notion that Susie was implicated in the crime by the gathering at their house following the tragedy. Furthermore, he argued that the prosecution's case relied solely on circumstantial evidence, which could be easily challenged. Susie's unusual behavior was not enough to indicate that she might resort to violence. Bill's family, however, argued that Susie's actions demonstrated a complete lack of empathy toward him. Meanwhile, an outraged Jim demanded justice for Bill and insisted that the killer be held responsible. Investigators suspect that someone else may have been involved in the crime and are questioning the circumstances surrounding the incident. Specifically, they were puzzled why Bill chose to end his life while lying next to his wife in bed. Typically, individuals who wish to end their lives tend to prefer doing so in solitude. If Bill were to choose to end his own life, he would have two methods to consider, either keeping a loaded weapon nearby, such as placing it by his bed or under his pillow, or waking up in the middle of the night, retrieving the weapon, and returning to bed before using it. Susie claimed she didn't notice Bill getting up at night, though it's possible she simply didn't wake up. She mentioned that she had once handled her husband's weapon after discovering it under the pillow. She explained that he kept it in the bedroom for self-defense, adding that such behavior was typical among Texans. Detectives, however, questioned why there were no fingerprints on the weapon if Susie had truly picked it up. Susie claimed that Bill regularly cleaned and wiped the weapon, but investigators remained skeptical. They began scrutinizing the dynamics of Susie's and Bill's relationship. During the inquiry, they discovered that she had multiple extramarital affairs during her marriage, and, importantly, Bill was aware of them. After numerous acts of infidelity, she and her children had left him and moved to Austin. However, Bill eventually persuaded her to return, and they resumed living together. Despite this reconciliation, many believed the relationship remained deeply strained. Susie and Bill were preparing for a divorce and discussing how to divide their assets, which created significant tension and might have given her a motive to murder her husband. Susie's behavior following the incident raised further suspicions. After the incident, upon realizing that her husband was seriously injured but still alive, she chose not to call an ambulance, a decision that might have increased his chances of survival. Instead, she called a colleague, Bill Luke Roy. Susie claimed she was confused and unsure of what to do in such a situation, so she sought advice from a family friend. This initially led some to speculate that Luke might have been involved in the crime, though no evidence supported this theory. According to Luke, Susie's voice lacked any signs of panic during their phone call. Nonetheless, Luke advised her to contact emergency services, which Susie did without hesitation after speaking with him. When experts investigated the scene and examined Bill's body, they discovered a bullet wound in his left hand. Strangely, despite the close-range attack, Susie, Bill's wife, was not covered in blood. Forensic experts noted that an attack at point-blank range typically produces small blood droplets. However, Bill's right hand was found neatly tucked beneath the pillow, which makes the possibility of him causing harm to himself in this manner highly unlikely. The prosecution built a strong case with a solid motive: financial gain. Susie, Bill's wife, appeared to benefit greatly from her husband's death, particularly in terms of insurance. Shortly before his death, Bill had made significant changes to his insurance policy. He increased the payout amount to nearly $2 million but removed Susie as a beneficiary. Instead, he designated the payout to his daughter from a previous marriage, Christine. Susie had even contacted the insurance company in advance to confirm the details of the policy. Crucially, these changes to the policy were set to take effect just days after Bill's death. During her call with the insurance company, Susie uncovered crucial information, which indirectly pointed to the possibility of a motive to act quickly. With Bill weighed down by financial troubles, his death could secure the money needed to resolve their outstanding debts. Apparently, Bill had removed Susie from the beneficiary list due to a lack of trust in her and instead sought to provide lifelong financial security for his daughter. This situation raised several troubling implications. Firstly, if Bill had planned his own death, he likely would have waited for the amended insurance policy to officially take effect, which would have occurred in just a few days. Furthermore, as someone knowledgeable in legal and financial matters, he would have been aware of Texas laws regarding voluntary death. Specifically, insurance policies do not pay out compensation to beneficiaries if the insured dies voluntarily within 2 years of the policy's activation. This means all of Bill's intentions to secure his daughter's future were doomed from the outset. Detectives believed that Bill had no intention of ending his life willingly. When he spoke about such matters, it was likely to evoke pity or manipulate others, such as persuading the bank to grant him a loan. However, given the strange circumstances surrounding his death, it seemed he didn't end his life himself. Someone might have helped him. Based on circumstantial evidence, Susie was arrested and charged with her husband's murder. At the trial, a key forensic method was used: blood spatter analysis. This technique, first introduced in the 1950s by Herbert MacDonald, played a critical role in providing evidence and substantiating the charges. MacDonald himself testified during Susie's trial, offering essential insights. Blood spatter analysis had been a foundational method in the U.S. justice system and widely accepted for years. However, in 2009, the National Academy of Sciences raised doubts about its reliability, emphasizing that accurate and meaningful use of the analysis requires significant expertise and experience. Evidence in Bill's murder case was analyzed by inexperienced experts, but this oversight was overlooked during the trial. Although blood sample analysis has been heavily criticized, it remains valuable and continues to be used, now exclusively by highly qualified and experienced specialists. In the past, doubts about this method had led to the reconsideration of several convictions. However, by the time of Susie's case, Herbert MacDonald's method was widely accepted and largely unquestioned. During the trial, Susie's ex-husband defended her, stating that he had never observed any signs of aggression throughout their relationship. He also stated that Susie was not even aware of how to use a weapon. Additionally, a family friend named Luke, Bill's business partner and Susie's initial point of contact after the incident, supported her and expressed his belief that Bill may have willingly ended his own life. Luke explained that he had planned to leave the car dealership due to work-related issues, and this decision had deeply affected Bill. In the final days of Bill's life, he reportedly struggled with loneliness. The prosecutor's office persisted in proving its case. To strengthen its argument, it presented the marital bed as evidence during the trial, complete with two mannequins representing Bill and Susie, as well as traces of Bill's blood that were still visible. This allowed the prosecution to vividly illustrate its version of what transpired on that tragic night. Despite the defense's efforts, the jury ultimately convicted Susie of murder, sentencing her on June 5, 1988, to life in prison without the possibility of parole. After the verdict, Susie still had a group of supporters who believed in her innocence, including her son, Wade, and her daughter from a previous marriage. Both worked tirelessly to overturn the conviction, firmly convinced that Susie had stood by her husband until the very end and was incapable of violence against him. While Susie served time in prison, Wade enrolled in law school and dedicated himself to meticulously reviewing the case. He searched for errors or misconduct by the prosecution and investigators, hoping to find grounds for an appeal. Wade collaborated closely with his mother's lawyer to challenge the verdict and fight for justice. The case required processing a massive amount of complex information, which made the effort time-consuming. Wade was determined to secure justice as Susie had already spent 8 years in prison. Eventually, Susie's lawyer submitted a critical appeal that could not be dismissed. During the prosecution's case, the blood spatter analysis played a key role, but serious concerns emerged about whether the forensic expert had been qualified to handle this aspect. The expert had examined over 40 stains found on the nightgown. Interestingly, the prosecution's main piece of evidence turned out to be its biggest weakness. The defense disputed the accuracy of the tests conducted on the nightgown, arguing that various substances, not just blood, could cause the fabric to glow. Moreover, the nightgown had never been specifically tested for blood, and since it was no longer available, its credibility as evidence was entirely compromised. The appeal was accepted, leading to a thorough reconsideration of the evidence before the 1990 retrial. The absence of blood spatter on the weapon can be explained as follows. The gunshot to Bill's left arm likely occurred while he was holding the weapon under the pillow, with his left hand positioned on the opposite side of his head. The shot caused an exit wound. Certain actions of the experts during the retrial seemed questionable. For instance, the forensic expert who conducted Bill's autopsy made a key statement. Although he admitted that he could not be absolutely certain Susie had killed Bill, he maintained, perhaps to protect his reputation, that Bill could not have harmed himself without external assistance. Given that only Bill and Susie were in the house, Susie was naturally seen as the prime suspect. Wade's legal studies and collaboration with attorneys proved invaluable. Together, they uncovered evidence of a conspiracy that violated Susie's constitutional right to a fair trial. A major revelation emerged when the prosecution brought in Herbert McDonald to re-examine Susie's nightgown and the prior findings. Contrary to the prosecutor's expectations, McDonald decisively refuted the arguments supporting Susie's guilt. However, rather than sharing McDonald's expert opinion, the prosecution deliberately concealed it and continued relying on the flawed evidence against Susie. Wade played a vital role in the fight for his mother's freedom. He now faced the challenge of presenting his findings to convince the jury. His analysis revealed deception on the prosecution's part, which violated the Brady Rule, a requirement for prosecutors to disclose all evidence that could potentially exonerate the defendant. McDonald's findings were pivotal in exposing this misconduct. Finally, Susie's day in court arrived in January 1998. By then, the once vibrant woman had been deeply affected by her years in prison, reduced to a shadow of her former self. Yet, in her weary eyes, there remained a glimmer of hope. She continued to steadfastly maintain her innocence. Susie's friends, who attended the same unusual gathering where the bedroom was repainted after her husband's death, described the event as an odd prank. They explained that it was initiated by a woman attempting to cover up the unsettling red stains in the room. According to them, Susie was unaware that her actions would later lead to accusations of evidence tampering. Both friends defended her, with one stating that the room had not been cordoned off with police tape and no warning had been issued that the investigation was ongoing. In fact, investigators initially concluded that Bill's death was a result of self-harm and showed little interest in the scene. They had planned to close the case and archive it, allowing Susie to remain in the house without implementing any security measures, such as sealing the room with police tape. The other friend explained that the group merely wanted to help Susie, who hesitated to let her children return to a bedroom stained with blood. Influenced by alcohol, they decided to repaint the room before the kids came home. Neither friend believed that Susie was guilty of any wrongdoing. During the retrial, an unqualified expert who had analyzed Susie's nightgown admitted that his original testimony at her first trial was baseless and lacked scientific foundation. Forensic expert Herbert McDonald reviewed the flawed methods used in the investigation and expressed disbelief. The stains were measured visually without proper tools, and there was no confirmation that the stains were even blood. As a result, the evidence was deemed unconvincing. Susie's lawyer presented a compelling argument during the trial, which led the jury to reconsider their stance. They began to entertain the possibility that Bill, Susie's husband, had voluntarily chosen to end his own life. Substantial evidence later emerged, outweighing the vague testimonies provided by several of Bill's friends. The defense strategy focused on one key factor underlying the tragedy: Bill's financial difficulties. After his loan application was denied, his business faced imminent collapse, pushing his family close to poverty. To ensure that his daughter from a previous marriage would receive a larger insurance payout, Bill is said to have decided to end his own life. He spent his remaining savings on increasing the life insurance payout for her. Bill's decision not to wait just a few additional days may have been driven by severe depression or a sudden deterioration in his mental health, which could have left him incapable of fully understanding the legal implications. Accounts of Bill's behavior in the days leading up to his death supported this conclusion. The defense attorney believed their case had been effectively argued. However, during the closing arguments, Susie unexpectedly lost control. As the prosecution delivered its final remarks, she screamed that she had not killed her husband and collapsed in tears. This emotional outburst took everyone by surprise. On one hand, the jury recognized the sincerity in Susie's tears and assertions of innocence. On the other hand, her uncontrolled aggression complicated the situation. Deliberations over the verdict lasted for 4 hours of tense uncertainty. Although no definitive resolution was reached regarding Susie's guilt or innocence, she was ultimately acquitted of all charges on January 23, 1998. Despite her acquittal, she continued to face opposition, with critics focusing heavily on her behavior throughout the trial. While Susie's actions were undoubtedly unusual at times, her supporters, including her son and daughter, attributed her behavior to the emotional toll and stress she endured during the ordeal. Her opponents, however, claimed that her outburst during the trial was a calculated attempt to manipulate the jury. In contrast, her lawyer argued that the outburst was unplanned, insisting that such a risky tactic would have been ill-advised, particularly since the defense had already presented substantial evidence that might have backfired with the jury. During subsequent hearings, it was revealed that the nightgown had never been used as evidence. This omission raised concerns among the investigative team, as items of such significance rarely vanish without explanation. Speculation arose that the prosecution, facing heavy criticism for their strategy, may have intentionally disposed of the nightgown to prevent further examination. This theory gained traction as many believed the nightgown might have undermined their case, particularly given the opinion of Herbert McDonald, whose expertise could have discredited their claims. Faced with mounting challenges, the prosecution seemingly had no viable path to continue their case. Susie Mowbray was acquitted on her 50th birthday, turning the occasion into a celebratory milestone. She expressed her gratitude to her son, Wade, describing it as the best anniversary gift she had ever received. In a 2001 interview, she reflected on her release, noting that others who had been wrongfully convicted alongside her had already been freed for 3 years. Susie had spent nearly a decade in prison and shared her hope that her children would feel proud of their mother. However, not everyone supported the verdict. Bill's first wife and his daughter, Christine, believed the outcome was unjust, remaining convinced that Susie had evaded accountability for murder. After Bill's death, his first wife revealed that Susie had urgently sold off all of his belongings to secure money. This led to a fierce legal battle between Bill's first wife and Susie over his inheritance. Ultimately, no one received the life insurance payout. Susie had once planned to write a book about her struggles, but since 2002, there has been no news about her. During that time, she went to court in an attempt to reclaim Bill's insurance payout, but she ultimately lost the case. Susie's son, Wade, initially pursued a legal career but eventually left the field to provide advice to other clergymen. Interestingly, Susie, who had previously sought public attention and appeared in her husband's advertising campaigns in the 1980s, completely disappeared from public view after her failed attempt to secure the insurance funds. She did not attend the TV show in 2021 that covered her case, though her lawyer did. The lawyer described her situation as a tragedy, emphasizing that the businessman's widow had spent so many years behind bars, which had destroyed her life, while insisting he had always believed in her innocence. The case of Marty Hill. Marty Hill, 42, lives in a cozy little town called Prairie Village, Kansas, USA. She is energetic, cheerful, and kind. From a young age, she was drawn to fine art, dreaming of becoming an artist or designer. To pursue this dream, she worked hard, completed her studies, and gained the necessary educational background. Eventually, she fulfilled her dream by working in the design studio of a clothing company. At the company, Marty is always highly regarded for his outstanding achievements and reliability. So, when she failed to show up for work on September 8, 2010, without any notice, everyone immediately suspected that something was wrong. No one knew what had happened, and she had not requested any leave. Initially, her colleagues hoped she might just be running late. They tried calling her but received no response and decided to wait a little longer. An important meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m., and Marty's attendance was deemed essential. Her absence worried everyone since she was always responsible and fully aware of the meeting's importance. She is usually deeply involved with the group and consistently reports any issues, so her silence in this case is unusual. Growing increasingly uneasy, one of her friends tried calling her repeatedly, but the calls went unanswered. Overcome with fear, the friend began to break down in tears, sensing deep in her heart that something terrible might have happened to Marty. A friend decided to find out what had happened to Marty. One of her colleagues offered to visit her house and check on her. He arrived at her quiet residential neighborhood at 11:30 a.m. and knocked on her door, but there was no answer. This seemed odd, especially since her car was parked in the driveway, suggesting she should have been home. He walked around the house but saw nothing unusual, although he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The unsettling silence made him uneasy, so he returned to his car. The colleague returned to the office and discussed the situation with the others. They decided it was necessary to call the police to check on Marty. Because Marty had a 15-year-old daughter who was at school at the time, they agreed not to alarm her until they obtained more information about Marty's whereabouts. Eventually, the police were contacted, and the colleague stayed near Marty's driveway, waiting for the police to arrive. The police arrived at the scene within minutes. When the officer knocked on the door, there was no response, and there were no signs of forced entry. Looking through a window, he noticed a woman's purse sitting on the kitchen table, which indicated that Marty should have been inside. Concerned, the officer decided to check the door, suspecting she might be unwell and in need of help. To his surprise, the door was unlocked. The officer entered the house and searched the first and second floors but found nothing out of the ordinary. He then proceeded to check the basement. Using a flashlight, the officer realized there were no lights in the basement. As he descended to the very bottom, he spotted someone lying in a large pool of blood, curled up in a fetal position. The dim light revealed a gruesome scene. The room was splattered with so much blood that it resembled a torture chamber. At first, the police thought the victim was a man due to the large amount of blood, but upon closer inspection, they couldn't even determine the victim's gender. Based on the scene, they concluded that the person was dead. However, to their horror, the victim suddenly turned around and looked directly at them. The police discovered a severe wound on the victim's throat and observed that her face was so swollen, disfigured it resembled a gruesome, bloody mess. Believing the victim was on the verge of death, an officer leaned in and repeatedly asked, "Who did this?" Despite his efforts, the victim struggled to breathe and was unable to speak. Prior to questioning, the officer had already called for medical assistance. Though still alive, the victim was unable to reveal the identity of her attacker. The victim was rushed to the nearest hospital due to her critical condition, which made identifying her difficult. Her injuries were concentrated on her head and face, including multiple skull fractures, facial fractures, a concussion, and cerebral swelling. The wound was particularly devastating, slicing through muscles and vital blood vessels. Medical experts estimated her chances of survival at no more than 20%. Finally, the victim was identified to be Marty Hill, the owner of the home. Against all odds, the doctors managed to save her life. Attention immediately turned to her teenage daughter, Mackenzie, who was contacted right away. Mackenzie was in complete shock and had no idea what had transpired at their home. Upon hearing of the brutal attack, family members rushed to the hospital to be with Marty. The extent of her suffering was unimaginable, and her injuries were so severe that even her own mother didn't recognize her. Unfortunately, the doctors all gave the same grim prognosis regarding her chances of survival. Her condition was serious, but at least it was somewhat manageable. Family members took turns staying by her bedside every day. The situation was so overwhelming that they felt a mix of anger and helplessness. Her son, Stephen, felt the most anger. Living in Texas at the time, he returned home to be with his mother and offer his support. Stephen was the first person to enter the basement where his mother had been found. After the forensic investigator examined the house, they emerged from the basement and strictly prohibited anyone else from entering due to the gruesome nature of the scene. While the relatives grieved, Stephen cleaned up the blood himself. Detectives investigating the tragedy were baffled, unable to determine who could have committed such an act or why. Marty's family and friends were equally perplexed, as no one could imagine her having an enemy capable of such violence. Investigators searched for clues in her personal life, workplace, and relationships with her children, but found nothing unusual. The crime was determined to be unrelated to abuse, as Marty's clothes remained intact, a conclusion later confirmed by the Armed Forces analysis. There was no indication of theft, nothing was missing, and the house showed no signs of forced entry. The circumstances of the crime were shrouded in mystery. Even Marty herself was unable to provide any information about the identity of her attacker. The police interviewed Marty's neighbors, but none of them were able to provide any significant information. The only clue reported was a sighting of a red, broken pickup truck near Marty's house at around 8 a.m., driven by a young, light-skinned, short man. This timing aligned with the approximate time of the attack determined by detectives. The officers followed up by visiting the sewing company where Marty worked to interview her colleagues, hoping to identify someone matching the description of the driver. However, this lead turned into another dead end, as none of her co-workers could offer useful information or suggest who might have been driving the pickup truck. Detectives then shifted their focus to Marty's family. They spoke with Marty's mother, Shirley Roth, who provided a potentially valuable lead. Shirley revealed that her daughter had not been romantically involved with anyone since divorcing her ex-husband 7 years earlier. Despite their divorce, they maintained regular contact because they shared custody of their daughter. Shirley explained that, following the divorce, Marty had dedicated herself entirely to her work and children and had shown no interest in dating. In Shirley's opinion, the only person who seemed like a potential suspect was Marty's ex-husband. This lead warranted further investigation, especially since Marty remained unconscious and unable to provide information herself. Detectives continued to speak with family members to identify Marty's ex-husband. Their children were quick to defend their father. Their daughter, Mackenzie, a high school student, took offense at the suggestion that her father could be a suspect. She asserted that her father could not have done such a thing, describing him as calm, non-confrontational, and someone who maintained a good relationship with his ex-wife and children. Their son, Stephen, also rejected the suspicion, stating that his father was incapable of committing the crime. Despite this, detectives could not dismiss the theory and decided to investigate it thoroughly. The police then visited Marty's ex-husband at his home. He was fully cooperative, invited them inside, and answered their questions openly. He appeared deeply affected by the incident, expressing that he still cared for Marty and was distressed by what had happened. He expressed relief that she had survived and shared that he was praying for her recovery. Although there was nothing initially suspicious, the police still needed to verify his alibi. He told them that, on the morning of the attack, he had taken his daughter to school before going to work. To confirm his statement, the police spoke with his daughter, Mackenzie, who was living with her grandmother, while they worked on verifying the details he had provided. A DNA sample was taken from him, though analysis would require time. For Mackenzie, the prohibition against seeing her father created additional hardship, making this a challenging period for everyone involved. The police also collected DNA samples from under Marty's nails, along with hair follicles found on her clothing. After comparing this evidence with the ex-husband's DNA, all suspicions about him were completely dismissed. His DNA did not match, and his alibi was verified. As a result, the ex-husband was officially cleared from the list of suspects, much to Mackenzie's relief. The family was finally able to reconnect and support one another as they waited for Marty to regain consciousness. Meanwhile, Marty's family tried to piece together what had happened and figure out who might have attacked her. Her mother, Shirley, recalled that not long before the incident, the grandmother's house had been broken into and robbed. This raised fears that the entire family could be targeted by a stalker intent on carrying out violent acts. However, the police had no definite answers, leaving the family engulfed in fear and paranoia. They had no clue who the perpetrator could be and clung to hope that Marty would recover and reveal what had truly happened. The family also recalled that, shortly before the attack, a handyman had visited Marty's house to change the locks. This handyman worked for B&J Construction, a company her mother and grandmother had trusted and hired for years. Coincidentally, he was the only unfamiliar person who had interacted with Marty in recent months. This raised suspicions that the handyman, who often did repair work for the family, might be connected to both the robbery and the assault. The police turned their attention to Brian Pennington, the handyman who had regularly visited Marty's house, her mother's house, and her grandmother's house to handle household repairs and maintenance. At the time, Brian was 26 years old, married, and the father of 2 children. He lived about an hour and a half away in a small town called Leeton, Missouri, with a population of around 500. On September 10, 2010, detectives decided to visit Brian's home. When they arrived, they immediately noticed a broken red pickup truck in the driveway, which matched a description provided by neighbors of a suspicious vehicle. However, the truck did not have license plates, so they were unable to confirm the match. Inside the house, they found Brian, who was cooperative and permitted the officers to enter his kitchen. He answered their questions openly. When asked about the truck, Brian explained that he didn't drive it because it had no license plates. He also mentioned that his last visit to Marty's house had been 3 to 4 days before the attack, during which he had checked the basement equipment. Brian didn't contact the police after seeing on the news that Marty had been attacked. He explained that he didn't know anything and couldn't provide any useful information about the case. Brian wasn't very familiar with Marty. Their interactions had been limited to working together on repairing her house. Although he considered her a respectable woman, that was all he could share with the authorities. However, detectives began to question his account. Their suspicions were triggered by the fresh scratches on his face, which might have been caused during a confrontation with Marty. When asked about these marks, he explained that they were caused by a dog that had scratched him while he was playing in the yard the day before the detectives came to visit. He acted fearful when accused of being involved in the crime, insisting that he was incapable of such an act. Brian provided an alibi, prompting investigators to verify his story. When detectives spoke to Brian's wife, Jessica, they noticed her odd behavior from the outset. She appeared hesitant, seemed afraid to disclose the truth, dodged direct questions, and mentioned there had been tension in their relationship lately. Jessica stated that her husband had been at home that morning, sleeping in another room, and added that the last time he had worked at Marty's house was about a month earlier. She also corroborated Brian's claim that the scratches on his face were caused by a dog. However, her demeanor suggested she was not being truthful. Detectives doubted her account, and she was taken to the station for further questioning. Authorities suspected Jessica might either be an accomplice to the crime or trying to shield the killer. Before leaving Brian's house, the police asked him whether they would find anything suspicious if they searched the property. Brian confidently stated that they wouldn't find anything and even agreed to let them look around. However, in the laundry basket, at the very bottom, they discovered a pair of jeans with suspicious stains. Brian explained that the stains weren't blood but merely machine oil left over from working on a pickup truck. He allowed the police to take the jeans for testing and voluntarily provided his DNA samples for comparison. The items were immediately sent to the forensic lab, where tests confirmed the stains were blood, not oil. However, additional time was needed to extract the DNA profile and compare it. While detectives awaited the test results, Marty regained consciousness in the hospital 12 days after the attack. Although she was able to communicate shortly thereafter, her initial days out of unconsciousness were clouded by confusion. During this time, she experienced constant pain and discomfort. It's not surprising that Marty needed to take a large number of medications during her recovery. Her poor health may have stemmed from her reliance on these drugs, in addition to the severe injuries she suffered. Despite the extensive brain damage she endured, her memory remained largely intact. Marty informed the police that Brian Pennington was the one who had attacked her. She described that morning's incident as starting entirely normally. She woke up early, got ready for work, and followed her usual routine. Around 7:30 a.m., she heard a car stop in front of her house but didn't pay it much attention. Soon after, there was a knock at the door. It was Brian, who had worked on her house about a month earlier. Marty found his visit odd from the beginning. It was unplanned and too early in the morning. However, she reassured herself, thinking he might have been working nearby or had forgotten a tool during his last visit. Although she was hesitant to open the door, she ultimately decided to do so. The two had a brief conversation. Brian was polite and friendly, which helped ease her concerns. Brian explained that he had heard Marty was planning to sell her house and wanted to alert her to a problem he had noticed during the previous renovation. He insisted it was important and offered to show her the issue in the basement. Curiosity overcame her, and she agreed to follow him downstairs. She recounted that everything happened very quickly. Initially, they were just walking downstairs, but an unsettling feeling suddenly came over her. Brian grabbed her and pushed her down the stairs, causing her head to hit hard against the concrete floor. Brian violently attacked Marty, choking her until she lost consciousness. Later, Marty explained that her memories of the incident were hazy, as though she were trapped in a fog. She occasionally regained consciousness, only to lose it again shortly afterward. Eventually, a policeman arrived at her home, and she was taken to the hospital. Investigators needed evidence to support Marty's account. Tests were conducted on a pair of jeans found in Brian's laundry basket, which revealed traces of Marty's blood. DNA samples taken from beneath her fingernails also matched his DNA. Law enforcement officers obtained an arrest warrant for Brian and visited his home, but he was not there. The search for him intensified, and soon police in the city discovered a damaged red pickup truck. Jessica was behind the wheel, and Brian was sitting in the passenger seat, visibly disheveled. Authorities charged Brian with attempted murder and robbery, setting bail at $1 million. The news stunned Marty's mother and grandmother, who had been in contact with Brian for years and trusted him as a professional handyman. Brian frequently worked for Marty's family, completing various household repairs. Tragically, it was Marty's mother who had recommended him to her daughter, leaving her with a deep sense of guilt. The family struggled to comprehend this senseless act of aggression. Brian's cruelty seemed inexplicable, and no clear motive emerged. Although he provided no explanation for his actions, experts were left baffled by the sheer brutality of the attack. Doctors were amazed that Marty had survived at all. Brian's violence extended far beyond simply choking Marty into unconsciousness. He threw her down a staircase, causing her to land headfirst on a concrete floor, fracturing her skull. He continued his attack relentlessly, beating her and slashing her throat. Marty struggled to comprehend what she could have done to warrant such a terrible fate. After sustaining severe head injuries, she faced challenges with her balance, although she eventually managed to walk independently. Shortly after emerging from a coma, she developed visual impairments, along with hearing and cognitive difficulties. Her family noticed that Marty seemed like a shadow of her former self, but they remained hopeful for her recovery. At times, she would lapse into long periods of thoughtfulness, which deeply concerned her loved ones, especially her daughter. Doctors refrained from making a definitive prognosis. While acknowledging the challenges Marty faced, they emphasized that her survival against the odds suggested that recovery was possible. After spending about a month in the hospital, Marty was finally discharged. During her recovery period, she became closer to her 16-year-old daughter, Mackenzie, whose birthday occurred while she was still in the hospital. Mackenzie was deeply touched by a card her mother wrote for her, even though the handwriting resembled that of a child. She recognized the long journey ahead and understood her vital role in supporting her mother as she gradually healed. Marty faced significant emotional challenges after the attack, struggling to reconcile how someone she had trusted deeply could turn out to be a vicious criminal capable of unprovoked violence. Seeking solace, she turned to her local church for emotional support. Meanwhile, Marty's family was determined to ensure that Brian faced justice and received a lengthy prison sentence. The prosecutor's office had overwhelming evidence to press charges against him, including physical proof, Marty's detailed account of the attack, scratches on Brian's face, DNA matches, and items stained with blood. The only missing piece was a clear motive. Brian had neither attempted to abuse Marty nor stolen anything from her home. His actions were simply a deliberate and calculated effort to kill her while working in her house. This act of violence was sudden and seemed to lack any apparent provocation. Marty had no prior conflicts with Brian, and relations between him and other women in her family had been peaceful. However, as police investigated Brian's background, they uncovered a troubling history of criminal activity. He had been convicted in 26 separate cases, most of which were related to domestic violence. His ex-wife and former girlfriends had reported him to the police numerous times. Jessica admitted that she had shielded him out of fear of becoming his next target, as his behavior was systematically abusive. Brian frequently threatened her, exhibiting a clear pattern of cruelty. Jessica testified for the prosecution during the trial, stating that Brian was not home on the night of the attack. She explained that he had been away for hours and only returned around noon, after Marty was assaulted. Upon his return, his clothes were covered in blood. When questioned, he claimed it was machine oil but offered no further explanation. Jessica also refuted his claim that the scratches were allegedly caused by the dog, revealing that he had forced her to lie under the threat of being killed. She provided detailed accounts of their married life, describing him as abusive, both physically and emotionally. During the trial, Brian was visibly shocked when Marty appeared alive in court to testify against him. Jessica, his wife, also testified for the prosecution, presenting evidence that contradicted his statements. Moreover, none of Brian's claims were corroborated during the hearings. Jessica submitted cell phone records showing that, at approximately 8 a.m. on the morning of the attack, she had tried to contact Brian. Geolocation data confirmed that he was near Marty's house at the time. As the evidence against Brian continues to build, he has no viable path to acquittal. To avoid a prolonged and traumatic trial, Brian was offered a plea bargain. Although he could have faced up to 40 years in prison, the deal reduced his sentence to 28 years. However, on the day his sentence was to be announced, Brian unexpectedly attempted to withdraw the plea agreement and plead guilty instead. The court rejected his request, citing no valid justification for accepting it. During the final courtroom proceedings, Marty directly asked Brian why he had attacked her and nearly killed her, but he refused to provide a reason or make any closing statements. Marty is still recovering from the devastating attack, which left permanent scars on her face and neck. The injuries have distorted her facial features and affected her mobility. Despite these challenges, Marty remains determined and continues to train rigorously, believing she can regain her former self or even surpass it. In interviews, she often reflects on how someone only 26 years old could commit such a cruel act. Her resilience and self-belief have helped her heal from this violent incident, strengthening her resolve in the process. Marty returned to her routine fairly quickly and has become even more active. She took up kickboxing to learn self-defense, and sports have played a significant role in her recovery. She also created a website aimed at supporting others who have experienced traumatic events, using her personal story to inspire and encourage healing. In addition to these efforts, Marty continues to work as a designer for a clothing company, channeling her creativity into her art as a way to manage anxiety and stress. She credits her daughter, Mackenzie, as the cornerstone of her recovery and is deeply grateful for her unwavering support. Recently, Marty published a book that details the horrific incident that changed her life, with the hope of inspiring others to overcome adversity through resilience. She now actively works as a motivational speaker, meeting with various communities and offering the same support that helped her rebuild her life. As for Brian Pennington, her attacker, he remains in prison and is estranged from his family, including his mother, ex-wife, and children, who have all cut ties with him.